There's a door in Vatican City that opens only for a handful of people each year. Behind it, stacked in 53 miles of shelving, are secrets older than Christianity itself. The entrance doesn't announce itself. No grand archway, no ornate markings to signal what lies beyond. Just a door, solid and unassuming, set into stone that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires. It's guarded not by armed sentries but by something far more effective: silence. The kind of silence that accumulates over centuries, that settles into corridors and seeps into the very walls until the absence of sound becomes a presence in itself. Step inside, and the air changes immediately. There's a coolness that has nothing to do with the season outside. Temperature-controlled environments maintain a constant climate, protecting what cannot be replaced. The humidity sits heavy on your skin, carefully calibrated to preserve parchment and vellum that would crumble to dust in ordinary conditions. And there's a smell distinct, unmistakable. Ancient paper carries a scent like vanilla, mixed with must, a sweetness born from lignin breaking down over centuries. Beneath it, sharper notes of preservation chemicals cut through, modern interventions trying to hold back time itself. Your footsteps echo on marble floors, each sound swallowed quickly by the weight of surrounding space. The shelving stretches beyond sight, rows upon rows disappearing into carefully lit distance. 53 miles. That's the number they give when pressed, though even that feels like an approximation, a way to quantify something that resists measurement. How do you measure the accumulated memory of an institution that has stood for 2 millennia? In the filtered light, dust particles hang suspended, drifting through air that feels thick with age. Some of these documents predate the Catholic Church itself. They're remnants of civilizations that Rome absorbed, conquered, or methodically erased from the surface world. Yet here they remain, preserved in climate-controlled chambers beneath the city that destroyed them. This raises a question that settles uncomfortably in the mind. Why would a Christian institution, one that spent centuries suppressing pagan knowledge, burning libraries, and condemning heresy, choose to preserve the very texts it publicly rejected? Why keep the astronomical charts of cultures that worshipped different gods? Why archive the religious ceremonies of faiths that Rome worked so hard to eliminate? The official answer speaks of historical preservation, of maintaining records for scholarly purposes, of understanding the past to illuminate the present. But there's a gap between what we're told and what the silence suggests. History, we've been taught, is written by the victors. What we're rarely told is that sometimes the victors don't write it at all. Sometimes they bury it. Sometimes they lock it behind doors that open only for those deemed worthy, and even then, only partially. Most people will never stand in these chambers. They'll never feel that particular humidity on their skin, or smell that distinctive combination of ancient paper and modern preservation. They'll never trace their fingers along bindings that were old when Gutenberg invented his press. The archives remain inaccessible not just physically but conceptually, a space that exists in our collective imagination more vividly than in anyone's direct experience. But tonight, through this narrative, we're going to explore what lies within those 53 miles of shelving. We're going to ask questions that most people never get close enough to ask. We're going to examine why certain knowledge gets preserved while other knowledge disappears entirely, and what that selection process reveals about power, control, and the stories we tell ourselves about the past. Because the door may be locked to most of us, but that doesn't mean we can't understand what it's protecting or who it's protecting it from. The Vatican changed the name from Secret to Apostolic Archives in 2019. The question is, what took them so long? For centuries, the very name conjured images of conspiracy and concealment. The Vatican Secret Archives. 3 words that launched 1,000 theories, each more elaborate than the last. But the truth, as it often does, lies in translation specifically, in the evolution of a single Latin word. Secretum, in Latin, doesn't mean what we think it means. Or rather, it once meant something closer to private or personal. The Pope's secretum was his private office, his personal domain. The archives weren't secret in the sense of hidden knowledge or forbidden texts. They were simply the Pope's private papers, the administrative backbone of the world's oldest continuously functioning institution. In 2019, the Vatican officially rebranded them as the Vatican Apostolic Archives. The change was presented as a linguistic correction, a way to align the English understanding with the Latin intention. Pope Francis himself authorized the shift, noting that secret had taken on connotations that didn't reflect the archive's actual nature. Yet the aura of mystery didn't dissipate with the name change. If anything, it raised new questions. Why now? Why, after centuries of allowing the world to call them secret, did the Church suddenly care about clarification? What changed the archives, or what people might be starting to suspect about them? The reality of the archives is simultaneously mundane and fascinating. The vast majority of the collection consists of exactly what you'd expect from an institution that has governed territories, conducted diplomacy, and managed complex bureaucracies for 2,000 years. Land deeds, financial ledgers, correspondence between bishops and cardinals, diplomatic cables from papal nuncios stationed around the world, tax records from the papal states, marriage dispensations, excommunication orders, the grinding administrative machinery of faith turned into governance. Scholars who wish to access the archives must navigate a lengthy application process. They must specify exactly what they're looking for and demonstrate legitimate academic purpose. They're granted access to certain materials, but not others. Documents less than 75 years old remain restricted, a rolling barrier that moves forward with each passing year. Even among older materials, certain collections remain mysteriously off-limits, their catalogues incomplete or strangely vague. This is where mundane bureaucracy intersects with genuine mystery. The Vatican has spent centuries acquiring documents from territories it controlled or influenced. When religious orders dissolved or merged, their libraries often ended up here. When cities fell to papal armies, their archives were absorbed. When missionaries returned from distant lands, they brought texts, maps, and artifacts with them. The result is a collection that extends far beyond the administrative records of the Catholic Church. Somewhere in those climate-controlled vaults are materials from civilizations that predated Christianity entirely, documents from cultures that Rome conquered and whose religions the Church officially rejected, astronomical observations from pagan priests, medical texts from Greek physicians, philosophical treatises from schools of thought that were later declared heretical. The Church preserved them. That's the part that demands explanation. An institution that spent centuries burning books it deemed dangerous, that maintained an index of prohibited books until 1966, that punished the mere possession of certain texts with excommunication. Or worse, this same institution carefully catalogued and preserved knowledge from the very traditions it worked to suppress. Perhaps it was scholarly impulse, the recognition that understanding what you oppose requires studying it. Perhaps it was insurance, keeping potential threats close where they could be monitored. Perhaps it was something else entirely, the acknowledgement that some knowledge, regardless of its origin, proves too valuable to destroy. Or perhaps, buried within administrative papers and diplomatic correspondence, there are things the Church didn't want destroyed but couldn't afford to let circulate freely. Questions without easy answers. Knowledge that complicated the official narratives too much to reconcile. The name may have changed, but the silence remains. Rome called itself eternal, but the cities it crushed into dust were older still. Their knowledge had to go somewhere. Imagine looking down at the Italian peninsula from some impossible height, watching not days or weeks but centuries unfold beneath you. Time moves differently from this perspective. You see the Mediterranean, not as it appears on modern maps, but as it existed 3,000 years ago, a living network of cultures, each with its own understanding of the world, its own technologies, its own relationship with the cosmos. Rome didn't emerge from nowhere. The land that would become the foundation of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen was already crowded with sophisticated civilizations when the first Romans were still tending sheep on 7 hills beside the Tiber. To the north, the Etruscans had already mastered metallurgy, urban planning, and hydraulic engineering. They built cities with complex sewage systems and created art that still confounds archaeologists. Their language, written in an alphabet, borrowed from the Greeks, but expressing something entirely different, remains only partially understood. They read omens in the flight of birds and the examination of animal entrails, a practice the Romans would later adopt and claim as their own. Along the southern coast and Sicily, Greek colonies flourished in what they called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Cities like Syracuse rivaled Athens in splendor. Philosophers, mathematicians, and physicians gathered in these centers of learning, contributing to a body of knowledge that would eventually be credited entirely to mainland Greece, as if distance and geography could erase contribution. The Phoenicians had established trading posts and settlements throughout the Mediterranean, bringing with them nautical knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of sea travel. Their understanding of currents, stars, and seasonal winds allowed them to navigate waters that others feared. They carried not just trade goods but ideas, mathematical systems, and astronomical observations between cultures that might never have connected otherwise. Further back in time, the mysterious Pelasgians were said to have inhabited these lands before recorded history began. Ancient Greek writers mentioned them as the people who were already there when the Greeks themselves arrived, a civilization so old it had become mythological even to the ancients. What they knew, what they built, what they understood about the world, most of it dissolved into rumour and scattered archaeological fragments. Dozens of Italic tribes, each with distinct languages and religious practices, occupied the peninsula. The Oscans, the Umbrians, the Samnites, the Sabines, they worshipped different gods, observed different rituals, maintained different relationships with the land and sky. Their priests performed ceremonies that predated Roman religion by centuries. Their astronomers tracked celestial movements and understood patterns that would later be attributed to Roman or Greek discovery. This was the world Rome inherited through conquest and absorption, not an empty landscape waiting to be civilized, but a tapestry of accumulated knowledge, refined over millennia by cultures that had their own moments of brilliance and discovery. When Rome rose to power, it didn't simply destroy what came before. The process was more complex, more calculating. Rome conquered, yes, but it also collected. It absorbed useful technologies and claimed them. It adopted effective administrative systems. It incorporated foreign gods into its pantheon when politically convenient. And it archived. The Catholic Church, inheriting Rome's imperial infrastructure and its methodical approach to knowledge management, became the ultimate custodian of this accumulated wisdom. Somewhere in those 53 miles of climate-controlled shelving might be astronomical charts from Etruscan priests, medical texts from Greek physicians in Syracuse, navigational records from Phoenician traders, religious ceremonies from tribes whose names most people have never heard. The question that should keep us wondering isn't whether such documents exist. It's why an institution that built its identity on replacing paganism would work so carefully to preserve pagan knowledge. What did they know that we don't? What did they find worth keeping? In one chamber, there's a section labelled only with Etruscan numerals. The cataloguer who noted it in 1881 wrote one word in the margin: undetermined. The Vatican Archives exist mostly underground. This isn't a conspiracy, it's engineering. Ancient documents require specific conditions to survive, and the most reliable way to maintain those conditions is beneath the earth, where temperature fluctuates less, where humidity can be controlled with precision, where the mere weight of soil and stone provides insulation against the chaos of the surface world. Walk through these spaces, and you enter a different relationship with time. The lighting is deliberately dim, calibrated to prevent the slow degradation that exposure causes to organic materials. Ultraviolet rays break down cellulose, turning paper brittle and ink pale. So the illumination here exists at a threshold bright enough to read by, but never bright enough to harm what's being read. It creates a perpetual twilight, a space that feels removed from the cycle of day and night that governs the world above. The temperature holds steady at 18 degrees Celsius. The humidity stays at 55%. These numbers aren't arbitrary. They represent the optimal balance for preserving parchment, vellum, and early paper. Too dry, and the materials become brittle, cracking at the slightest touch. Too humid, and mold blooms, consuming centuries in days. Sophisticated climate control systems monitor and adjust constantly, maintaining an artificial perfection that nature never provides. The shelving stretches in rows that seem to generate their own infinity. Dark wood, floor to ceiling, each section bearing labels in Latin. But these aren't the neat, logical labels of a modern library. They reference papal reigns, geographic territories that no longer exist, religious orders that dissolved centuries ago. One shelf might be marked with a pope's name and dates. The next might reference a monastery in a region that's now part of 3 different countries. The organization reflects the accumulated nature of the collection. Each edition catalogued according to the system that made sense at the time it was acquired, with little effort to unify everything into a single, comprehensible structure. This creates a labyrinth of knowledge. Even scholars who have spent decades working in the archives describe getting lost, not physically but intellectually, following one reference only to discover it's catalogued under a completely different system, finding that what they thought was one document is actually scattered across multiple collections, organized by different principles. Many sections have never been fully catalogued. The project is simply too vast. Estimates suggest it would take hundreds of scholars working full-time for decades to create a comprehensive index of everything contained in these miles of shelving. So instead, there are partial catalogues, indexes that cover certain collections but not others, finding aids that become outdated as new discoveries reorganize understanding of what's actually here. Handling the documents requires ritual precision. White cotton gloves, changed frequently to avoid transferring oils from previous materials. Pages turned with specialized tools designed to minimize stress on ancient bindings. For the oldest materials, papyrus fragments from Egypt, vellum scrolls from the early medieval period, even breathing too close can cause damage. The moisture in human breath, repeated over hours of study, can begin the process of deterioration. Vellum has a particular weight to it, a density that paper lacks. It's animal skin, after all, processed and stretched and treated until it could hold ink without bleeding. Pick up a vellum document from the 8th century and you feel the ghost of the animal it came from. Papyrus is different, lighter, more fragile, with a texture that speaks of reeds and river water and Egyptian sun. Early paper, the kind that started appearing in European documents in the 13th century, feels almost modern by comparison, though even that crumbles now if handled roughly. There are chambers here that haven't been thoroughly examined in generations. Storage areas where boxes sit untouched because no one has requested their specific contents in living memory. Sections where the labels themselves have faded into illegibility, where the only way to know what's inside is to physically open containers and examine what they hold. And in those forgotten spaces, among documents waiting for someone to request them, who knows what still rests in controlled twilight, preserved perfectly but unseen. A French paleographer spent 17 years requesting documents. On her last day, in her final box, she found a reference to something that shouldn't exist. An Etruscan prophecy recorded in Latin, dated to 12 BCE. The application process to access the Vatican Archives can take years. Sometimes it takes longer to gain permission than to complete the actual research. Scholars must specify exactly what they're seeking, demonstrate legitimate academic credentials, provide detailed proposals explaining why their work requires access to these specific materials. The Vatican reviews each application carefully. Many are denied without explanation. Those who are accepted often describe the approval letter as one of the most significant moments of their academic careers. But approval is only the beginning. Once inside, scholars face constraints that would frustrate anyone accustomed to modern research methods. Hours are limited. The reading rooms close early. There's no browsing the shelves. No casual exploration. Researchers must request documents by their catalogue numbers, often without knowing precisely what those documents contain. You ask for a box, wait for it to be retrieved from the depths of the archives, and only then discover whether it holds what you hoped, or something entirely different. This creates a strange paradox. To find something, you must already have some idea of what you're looking for. But the most significant discoveries in archival research almost never come from finding what you set out to find. They come from accidents, from cross-references that lead somewhere unexpected, from a marginal notation in one document that mentions another, from the moment when what you're reading doesn't match what the catalogue said you'd be reading. A German historian spent 6 months requesting every document related to Renaissance-era excavations in Tuscany. He was researching how early archaeologists interpreted Etruscan tomb paintings. In his 43rd box, he found a letter from a cardinal describing objects discovered in 1542 objects that included what the cardinal called tablets of great antiquity, inscribed in the manner of the old peoples. The letter mentioned these tablets being sent to Rome for examination. The historian requested every document related to that shipment. None existed, or rather, none could be found. The trail went cold, but the reference remained, proof that something had been discovered, catalogued, and then lost or hidden in the centuries since. This is the rhythm of archival research. Months of tedium, hours of squinting at handwriting that's barely legible, in languages that shift between Latin, Italian, and regional dialects that haven't been spoken in centuries. You develop a particular kind of patience, the ability to sit with uncertainty, to follow threads that might lead nowhere, to accept that most days will yield nothing remarkable. And then, without warning, the nothing becomes something. An American scholar studying papal diplomacy in the late Republic requested correspondence from the period. One letter, discussing routine administrative matters, mentioned in passing that a Roman official had consulted the old books of Etruria regarding an omen. Just a phrase, easy to overlook. But it confirmed something. Rome had access to Etruscan religious texts and considered them authoritative enough to consult for major decisions. The scholar spent the next 3 years requesting anything that might relate to this reference. She found 6 more mentions, scattered across different collections, different time periods, each one a fragment. Each one suggesting a larger body of knowledge that once existed. Other researchers have reported similar experiences. A catalogue entry that doesn't match its contents. A document filed in the wrong section that turned out to be far older than everything around it. References to materials about Carthage that survived the burning of that civilization's libraries. Greek manuscripts from colonies in southern Italy that contain astronomical observations unknown to modern science. The scholars who work in these archives develop a particular expression when they discuss their findings. It's not quite excitement, not quite frustration. It's the look of someone who has touched the edge of something vast and realizes they'll never see its full shape. But they keep requesting documents anyway, box after box, year after year, because even fragments can illuminate. One document, catalogued simply as pre-Roman observations, contains star charts that match the sky over Italy from 700 BCE, 2 centuries before Rome supposedly existed. The pre-Roman materials in the Vatican Archives don't exist as a unified collection. There's no section labelled Before Rome, where everything is neatly gathered. Instead, these documents are scattered throughout the miles of shelving, filed according to how and when they arrived, rather than what they contain. A fragment of Etruscan text might sit in a box with Renaissance correspondence, because that's when it was discovered and sent to Rome. Greek astronomical charts from Magna Graecia might be catalogued under the religious order that preserved them, not under Greek science or pre-Roman astronomy. Understanding how these materials ended up here requires understanding the Vatican's relationship with history itself. When the Catholic Church inherited the administrative infrastructure of the Roman Empire, it also inherited Rome's archives, everything the empire had collected, catalogued, and preserved. That meant centuries of accumulated documents from territories Rome had conquered, peoples it had absorbed, civilizations it had methodically erased from political existence, but whose records it kept for administrative purposes. Later editions came through different channels. During the Renaissance, wealthy collectors excavated ancient sites throughout Italy. When they unearthed tombs, they found not just pottery and jewelry, but texts, inscriptions, tablets, fragments of longer works. Many of these ended up donated to the church, either as gifts seeking favor or as bequests in wills. The Vatican became a repository not through conspiracy, but through the simple fact that it was the most stable, longest-lasting institution in Europe. If you wanted something preserved for future generations, you gave it to an entity that had already survived 1,000 years. Confiscations added more. When religious orders were suppressed, their libraries were absorbed into the Vatican's collections. Some of these monasteries had themselves been preserving ancient texts for centuries, materials that predated Christianity, but that scholarly monks found intellectually valuable. When the Jesuits were temporarily dissolved in 1773, their extensive libraries, including materials gathered from around the world, were transferred to Vatican control. What actually exists in these scattered collections? The confirmed materials are both remarkable and frustratingly incomplete. There are copies of Etruscan religious texts, translated into Latin during the late Roman Republic, by priests who wanted to understand the divination practices Rome had adopted. Greek astronomical charts from colonies in southern Italy show observations of celestial patterns, some of which align with modern understanding, and some of which suggest different interpretative frameworks. Fragments of Carthaginian accounting systems survived because Roman bureaucrats found them useful for managing similar trade networks. Descriptions of Pelasgian monuments, recorded by Roman historians before those structures were destroyed or repurposed, preserve the only written record of what once stood. Medieval monks compiled comparative studies of pre-Roman languages, trying to understand how Latin evolved from earlier Italic tongues. These linguistic works contain quotations from texts that no longer exist, fragments preserved in quotation that outlived the original works they cited. The Church's motivations for keeping these materials were layered and complex. Some documents were preserved for pure scholarship, understanding the development of language, the evolution of architectural techniques, the progression of astronomical knowledge. Others were kept as cautionary examples, demonstrations of pagan error that could be used in theological arguments. Still, others contained practical information too valuable to discard. Agricultural techniques developed over centuries didn't become useless just because the civilization that developed them worshipped different gods. Engineering principles worked regardless of religious context. But what survives is maddeningly incomplete. References to longer works that have vanished, fragments torn from context, copies that may have been altered during transcription, either accidentally through scribal error or deliberately to remove content deemed inappropriate. It's like trying to understand a conversation by reading every 10th word. You get glimpses of meaning, suggestions of larger ideas, but never the complete picture. Yet even these fragments reveal something crucial. Rome didn't emerge fully formed, civilized and brilliant from mud huts beside the Tiber. It inherited, adopted, and built upon foundations laid by civilizations that were already ancient when Rome was young. The question is, what else those civilizations knew that didn't survive even in fragments? The Etruscans taught Rome how to read the will of the gods. Then Rome forgot the Etruscans' names. Before Rome became an empire, before it became a republic, before it became anything more than a collection of settlements on 7 hills, the Italian peninsula already hummed with urban life. To the north, in the region Romans would later call Etruria, cities rose from the landscape with a sophistication that would take Rome centuries to match. These weren't villages. They were planned urban centers with stone walls, paved streets, and underground infrastructure that moved water through the city and waste away from it. The Etruscans built aqueducts while Rome was still drawing water from the Tiber. They engineered drainage systems that kept their cities dry and sanitary, while other settlements wallowed in mud during heavy rains. Walk through an excavated Etruscan city today, and you can still see the channels carved into bedrock, the careful slope that used gravity to move water exactly where it needed to go. Their wealth came from trade. Etruscan ships carried goods across the Mediterranean, connecting with Greek colonies, Phoenician traders, and peoples whose names have vanished from history entirely. They worked metal with extraordinary skill, bronze mirrors polished to reflective perfection, gold jewelry so intricate that modern jewelers struggle to replicate the techniques. Their tombs, painted with scenes of banquets and dancers and musicians, suggest a culture that celebrated life even as it prepared for death. They had writing, not just marks or symbols, but a full alphabet borrowed from the Greeks and adapted to their own language. They carved it into stone, scratched it onto pottery, inscribed it onto bronze tablets and mirrors. They were literate, capable of recording their thoughts, their histories, their understanding of the world. And yet, we can barely read what they wrote. The Etruscan language remains only partially deciphered. We can sound out the words, recognize some names, understand basic grammatical structures, but the longer inscriptions, the complex texts, the nuanced meanings, they slip away from us. It's like hearing someone speak in a room next door, catching the rhythm and cadence, but missing the actual words. Most of what we know about the Etruscans comes from the people who conquered them. Roman authors wrote about Etruscan customs, Etruscan religion, Etruscan cities, but these accounts are filtered through Roman prejudices, Roman agendas, Roman attempts to define themselves against what came before. It's history written by the victors, and like all such histories, it tells us as much about the writer as the subject. What archaeology reveals is tantalizing precisely because it's fragmentary. We have tombs, yes, elaborate and beautiful. We have objects of daily life, pottery, tools, jewelry, mirrors. We have short inscriptions, names on graves, dedications on ritual objects, boundary markers defining sacred spaces. What we don't have are the texts that every literate civilization produces. Where are the Etruscan histories? Their religious books, their literature, their philosophy, their scientific treatises? They had to have existed. You don't develop sophisticated urban planning without written technical knowledge passed between generations. You don't maintain complex religious systems without documenting rituals and interpretations. You don't conduct international trade without contracts, correspondence, records of transactions. Somewhere, at some point, these texts existed. The question that haunts Etruscan studies is simple and unanswerable. Did they simply decay, victims of time and organic materials breaking down over centuries, or were they deliberately destroyed? Rome provides uncomfortable evidence for the latter possibility. The Romans didn't just conquer Etruscan cities, they consumed Etruscan culture while systematically erasing Etruscan political identity. They adopted Etruscan religious practices wholesale, employing Etruscan priests called haruspices to interpret omens by examining animal entrails. They used Etruscan rituals to found new cities, following procedures they believed guaranteed divine favor. They incorporated Etruscan engineering, Etruscan architecture, Etruscan art. Roman aristocrats sent their sons to Etruscan cities to be educated. Roman generals consulted Etruscan prophets before battles. Roman builders used Etruscan techniques for their grandest projects. Yet, at the same time, Rome was conquering those Etruscan cities one by one, absorbing them into Roman territory, replacing Etruscan independence with Roman administration. It's a peculiar kind of cultural cannibalism. Rome ate the Etruscans, digested their knowledge and techniques, and then forgot to mention where the meal came from. Later Roman writers would attribute to Roman genius innovations that were actually Etruscan in origin. The sewers beneath Rome, the arches that would become synonymous with Roman architecture, the religious practices that Romans considered distinctly their own, all had Etruscan precedents, Etruscan teachers, Etruscan foundations. What remains now are shadows. Beautiful shadows, rich with artistry and craft, but shadows nonetheless. We can see the outline of what the Etruscans were, glimpse their sophistication through the objects they left behind, recognize their influence on everything that came after. But their own voices, their own words explaining who they were and what they knew, those have largely gone silent. Unless, somewhere in climate-controlled darkness, fragments of those voices still wait. Emperor Claudius spent years studying Etruscan history. His 20 volumes have vanished, but in 1682, a Vatican librarian noted fragments of Claudius's work in an unmarked box. The box's current location is listed as relocated. Rome had a complicated relationship with Etruscan knowledge. They needed it, even as they worked to erase the people who created it. The Etrusca disciplina, the Etruscan system of religious interpretation and divination, wasn't superstition to Roman minds. It was technology, a systematic method for understanding patterns in nature and extracting meaning from them. The Romans documented it extensively, not to mock it but to use it. Cicero wrote about Etruscan haruspices, the priests who read divine will through the examination of animal livers and entrails. He described their methods in detail, explaining how different formations indicated different outcomes, how the position of organs related to cosmic forces. Pliny the Elder catalogued Etruscan beliefs about lightning, explaining their classification system that recognized 9 different types of thunderbolts, each sent by different deities for different purposes. Livy mentioned the Libri Rituales, ritual books that covered everything from the proper founding of cities to agricultural practices aligned with celestial cycles. These weren't simple guidebooks. They represented accumulated knowledge covering astronomy, meteorology, agriculture, and urban planning, all interpreted through a religious framework that Romans found both foreign and valuable. The Etruscans had observed patterns over centuries, recorded correlations between celestial events and earthly outcomes, developed procedures that seemed to work even if the underlying explanations invoked gods that Rome officially didn't worship. During the late Republic and early Empire, when Rome still had living Etruscan speakers and functioning Etruscan institutions, some of these texts were translated into Latin. The process made sense from Rome's perspective. Preserve the useful knowledge, make it accessible in Latin, allow it to be incorporated into Roman practice without requiring Romans to learn a dying language. The paradox cuts deep. Rome valued Etruscan knowledge enough to translate, preserve, and actively use it. Roman senators consulted Etruscan priests before major political decisions. Roman armies employed Etruscan diviners before battles. Roman city planners followed Etruscan procedures when founding new colonies. Yet Rome simultaneously dismantled Etruscan political structures, absorbed Etruscan territories, and worked to eliminate Etruscan cultural independence. Emperor Claudius represents the strange apex of this relationship. He was obsessed with Etruscan history in a way that other Roman emperors weren't. He supposedly wrote 20 volumes on Etruscan civilization in Greek, attempting to document everything he could learn about the people who had taught Rome so much. Ancient sources mention this work, later writers reference it, and then it vanishes from the historical record, lost sometime in the chaos of the late empire. But knowledge rarely disappears completely. It fragments, scatters, resurfaces in unexpected places. Medieval monastic scholars occasionally encountered manuscripts that puzzled them. A 9th century catalogue from a Tuscan monastery lists among its holdings ancient Tuscan texts in unknown letters. The cataloguer made no attempt to translate or interpret, he simply noted their existence, an archivist acknowledging materials he couldn't read but felt obligated to preserve. A 12th century scholar left a marginal note in a manuscript he was copying, mentioning his frustration at trying to decipher an older text that mixed barbarian characters with Latin translations. He couldn't make sense of the non-Latin portions, but he carefully preserved the Latin, perhaps recognizing that future scholars might have tools he lacked. Renaissance collectors claimed to possess Etruscan Latin bilingual texts, documents that showed Etruscan phrases alongside their Latin equivalents. Some were certainly forgeries. The Renaissance hunger for classical antiquity created a market for fake artifacts, but not all of them. Some descriptions are too specific, too consistent with what we now know from archaeology, to dismiss entirely. The question becomes one of trajectory. When monasteries were suppressed, where did their unusual holdings go? When religious orders were dissolved, what happened to their libraries? When Renaissance families died out, who inherited their collections of ancient materials? The historical current flows toward Rome, toward the institution with the longest continuity, the most stable infrastructure, the greatest capacity for preservation. Materials moved from smaller repositories to larger ones, from regional collections to centralized archives, from scattered holdings to the Vatican's climate-controlled vaults. We can't prove that specific Etruscan materials ended up there. The chain of custody has too many gaps, too many moments where documents could have been lost, destroyed, or scattered. But the absence of proof isn't proof of absence. Sometimes silence is just waiting for the right question. A Renaissance scholar's notebook contains a phrase he claimed was the Etruscan greeting to the dead. In 1964, it was found carved on a tomb wall that had been buried for 2,400 years. He had been right. What modern scholars have found in the Vatican archives regarding Etruscan materials isn't the dramatic cache of lost books that popular imagination might hope for. It's something more modest and, in its own way, more remarkable. Evidence of how knowledge about the Etruscans survived through copying, annotation, and careful preservation across centuries. Italian philologists working in the archives during the 20th century documented a 15th century manuscript containing what appears to be a glossary of Etruscan terms paired with Latin equivalents. The manuscript itself is a copy. The script and materials make that clear, but the source it was copied from remains unknown. The glossary includes words for religious concepts, architectural terms, and names of deities, some of which match inscriptions archaeologists would later discover on Etruscan sites. The copyist added his own notes in the margins, expressing frustration at words he couldn't properly render in Latin, concepts that apparently didn't translate cleanly. Another document, this one from the 16th century, describes an excavation near Tarquinia. The account includes sketches of bronze tablets found in a tomb, along with attempts to transcribe the writing on them. The transcriptions are amateur, clearly made by someone unfamiliar with Etruscan script, but they preserve a record of objects that have since disappeared. The notebook also contains the excavator's attempts to translate certain phrases based on similar words he'd seen in Roman texts about Etruscan religion. Most of his translations were probably wrong, but the effort itself is revealing. It shows Renaissance scholars actively trying to understand Etruscan language through comparison and deduction. Perhaps most valuable are the collections of drawings made during the 16th and 17th centuries of Etruscan tomb paintings. The artists who made these sketches were documenting what they saw in newly opened tombs, paintings that were already beginning to deteriorate from exposure to air and light. Some of those tombs have since collapsed. Others have had their paintings fade to near invisibility. The Vatican copies preserve visual evidence that would otherwise be completely lost, showing details of Etruscan daily life, religious ceremonies, and mythological scenes that inform current understanding of Etruscan culture. These materials aren't the earth-shattering revelations of conspiracy theories. They're quieter than that, more academic. But their significance shouldn't be underestimated. They represent fragments of a transmission chain, stretching back through Renaissance humanism, to medieval monasticism, to late Roman scholarship, to the living Etruscan culture itself. Each link in that chain had the opportunity to distort, to lose information, to add errors. Yet enough accuracy survived that modern researchers have been able to verify details, confirm locations of archaeological sites, and better understand religious practices by cross-referencing these scattered sources. The Renaissance interest in Etruscan materials was partly about establishing Italian cultural identity independent from classical Rome. Scholars and collectors wanted to prove that the Italian peninsula had a sophisticated civilization before Rome, that their ancestors were more than just the conquered subjects of empire. This created a market for Etruscan artifacts and texts, which unfortunately also created incentive for forgery. Some materials from this period are genuine, some are enthusiastic fabrications, many fall somewhere in between copies of copies, interpretations layered upon interpretations, fact and speculation blended together over generations. The Vatican became a natural repository as these collections changed hands. Families died out, donating their holdings to the church. Collectors sought the preservation that only institutional backing could provide. Materials flowed from private collections into ecclesiastical hands, from scattered ownership to centralized archives. Modern Etruscologists using these holdings have made genuine contributions to the field. They've confirmed Etruscan words that were previously uncertain. They've verified the existence of religious practices that Roman sources mentioned, but that skeptical modern scholars doubted. They've connected scattered references across different sources, building a more complete picture from fragments that individually seemed insignificant. It's detective work conducted across centuries, each generation of scholars adding small pieces to an enormous puzzle that will probably never be complete. But incomplete doesn't mean worthless. Even fragments illuminate, even shadows reveal shapes. And sometimes, as that Renaissance scholar discovered, fragments preserved in archives turn out to be precisely, verifiably accurate when compared against evidence that stayed buried for millennia. Before they were all Romans, the people of Italy spoke at least 30 distinct languages. 28 of them have no surviving literature. The question is, did they never write, or did someone stop preserving what they wrote? Look at the Italian peninsula before Rome unified it, and you see not a single culture waiting to become Roman, but a mosaic of distinct peoples, each with their own identity, their own way of understanding the world. The Samnites controlled the central Apennine Mountains, fierce and independent. They built fortified hilltop cities, maintained a confederation of tribes that operated through consensus rather than centralized power, and fielded armies that fought Rome to a standstill for 50 years across 3 separate wars. Their warriors wore distinctive bronze helmets and carried shields designed for mountain warfare. Rome eventually conquered them, but not easily, and not without adopting Samnite military equipment and tactics in the process. The Sabines lived in the hills northeast of Rome, close enough to become entangled in Roman mythology. The famous rape of the Sabine women story that Rome told about its founding reflects a deeper truth. Rome and the Sabines were intimately connected from the beginning. Sabine religious practices became central to Roman religion. The word Sabine itself appears in some of Rome's oldest religious formulas, prayers whose meanings Romans of the later Republic no longer fully understood, but continued to recite because tradition demanded it. The Oscans dominated Campania and much of southern Italy, speaking a language related to Latin but distinct from it. We have Oscan inscriptions on tomb walls, on public monuments, on curse tablets buried in graves. The language shows sophisticated grammatical structures and specialized vocabulary for legal, religious, and commercial contexts. These weren't pre-literate people leaving simple marks. They were documenting contracts, recording laws, preserving religious texts. The Umbrians, the Lucanians, the Messapians in the heel of Italy, the Veneti in the north, each controlled territories, maintained cities, developed distinctive artistic styles and architectural traditions. Archaeological evidence reveals regional variations in everything from pottery decoration to metalworking techniques to burial practices. These differences weren't accidental. They reflected distinct cultural systems, different ways of organizing society and understanding the cosmos. Along the southern coast and in Sicily, Greek colonies established city-states that rivaled Athens and Sparta in sophistication. Tarentum, Syracuse, Croton, these were centers of learning where philosophers taught, mathematicians calculated, physicians practiced medicine according to the latest understanding. They were Greek in culture but Italian in geography, and when Rome absorbed them, it absorbed their accumulated knowledge along with their territory. Each of these peoples had languages. We know because we've found inscriptions. The Iguvine tablets, discovered in Umbria, contain the longest text in the Umbrian language, detailed descriptions of religious ceremonies, complete with prayers, ritual procedures, and organizational structures. If the Umbrians could produce this level of written documentation for religious purposes, they could certainly write about other subjects, history, law, practical knowledge. Yet for most of these cultures, nothing else survives. No historical chronicles, no philosophical treatises, no medical texts, no agricultural manuals, just fragments, a legal formula here, a religious inscription there, a handful of words quoted by Roman authors who found them interesting or exotic. The standard explanation is that these cultures were primarily oral, that they didn't develop extensive written traditions, that literacy was limited to basic inscriptions. But that explanation feels incomplete. The Igavine tablets prove sophisticated written capability. The Oscan legal inscriptions demonstrate technical vocabulary and complex grammatical structures necessary for documenting detailed agreements. These are markers of cultures that could write and did write. When Rome conquered these peoples, it absorbed their populations. They became Roman citizens or Roman subjects. Their children learned Latin, adopted Roman customs, participated in Roman institutions. Within a few generations, the old languages faded from daily use, spoken only by the elderly, remembered only in fragments. But absorption isn't the same as erasure. Rome didn't just conquer it, also documented, catalogued, collected. Roman scholars interviewed the last speakers of dying languages, recorded ancient customs, preserved what they found useful or interesting. The question that hovers over all of this: when those Roman scholars wrote down what they learned, where did those writings go? Varro wrote 490 books. 41 survived. In one of the lost volumes, he claimed to have translated prayers from the language of the ancient Sabines prayers that Rome still used but no longer understood. Marcus Terentius Varro lived from 116 to 27 BCE, straddling the collapse of the Roman Republic and the rise of the empire. He was Rome's greatest scholar, a man whose intellectual curiosity extended to everything: agriculture, astronomy, language, religion, history, philosophy. He wrote encyclopedically, attempting to document the entire scope of Roman knowledge and its origins. What made Varro unusual among Roman writers was his interest in origins. He didn't just accept Roman practices as naturally Roman. He asked where they came from, who created them first, what they meant before Rome adopted them. This led him to investigate the cultures Rome had conquered and absorbed: the Sabines, the Etruscans, the Oscans, the Umbrians, all the peoples whose territories had become Roman, but whose distinct identities were fading. Varro recognized that Roman religion was a composite creation. Different gods, different rituals, different sacred formulas had been borrowed from different peoples and stitched together into what Romans called their traditional worship. Some prayers were in archaic Latin so old that contemporary Romans couldn't parse the grammar. Others included words that weren't Latin at all, preserved phonetically because they were considered sacred but no longer understood. He interviewed elderly people in regions Rome had recently conquered, people who still remembered the old ways. He examined ancient inscriptions on monuments that predated Roman control. He consulted local records where they existed, documenting practices that were dying out as younger generations adopted Roman customs and forgot their ancestors' traditions. Other Roman scholars followed similar pursuits. They wrote about the diversity that had existed in Italy before unification, the regional variations in law and custom, the different languages and their relationships to Latin. They preserved knowledge not out of nostalgia but out of intellectual curiosity and the practical recognition that understanding Rome's components helped explain Rome itself. The irony cuts deep. These scholars documented the cultures Rome was erasing through assimilation, yet their very documentations have themselves mostly vanished. Of Varro's 490 books, only one survives. Complete a treatise on agriculture. We have fragments of a few others. The rest are known only through mentions in later authors' works, titles in ancient library catalogues, brief quotations by writers who had access to volumes that subsequently disappeared. The same pattern holds for other antiquarian scholars. Their works are lost. What survives are fragments embedded in other texts, quotations used to make different points, references that preserved a sentence or paragraph while the original work vanished. Medieval monks copying classical texts become the accidental preservers of this knowledge. They copied works by Christian authors like Augustine, who quoted pagan authors like Varro, who had documented practices of conquered peoples. The chain of preservation stretches across centuries, each link motivated by different concerns, but the chain holds nonetheless. Augustine quotes Varro on Sabine religious practices when making theological arguments about pagan superstition. The monk copying Augustine doesn't care about Sabines, he's preserving Christian apologetics. But the fragment about Sabine ritual survives because it's embedded in a text the monk values. Aulus Gellius, writing in the 2nd century CE, preserves a fragment about Oscan legal terminology in a book of miscellanies. Pliny mentions agricultural techniques learned from the Sabines in his encyclopedic Natural History. These fragments weren't preserved because anyone valued the specific information about Oscans or Sabines. They survived because they were adjacent to information that later eras found valuable. This creates an archaeological site made of text rather than soil. Buried in the vast collections of classical and medieval manuscripts are fragments about pre-Roman Italy, scattered through works catalogued for entirely different reasons. A scholar searching for theological commentary might pass over a reference to Samnite customs without noticing its significance. A cataloguer focused on Latin grammar might miss the importance of a quoted phrase in a language Rome conquered. The fragments exist, but finding them requires looking at old texts with new questions. The Romans planted crops according to a calendar they claimed was ancestral wisdom. A fragment found in 1851 revealed it was the Sabine agricultural cycle, based on stellar observations that predate Rome by 3 centuries. What survives of pre-Roman Italian knowledge comes to us in pieces, scattered across different types of evidence that must be assembled like a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. The Iguvine tablets, discovered in 15th century Umbria and now preserved in a museum in Gubbio, contain the longest surviving text in the Umbrian language. 7 bronze tablets, inscribed with detailed instructions for religious ceremonies. They describe processions, sacrifices, prayers, and the organizational structure of Umbrian priesthoods. The level of detail is remarkable. These aren't simple ritual formulas but complex procedural documents, suggesting a bureaucratic approach to religion that required precise written records. If the Umbrians could produce this for religious purposes, what else did they document that didn't survive? Roman sources mention Samnite sacred books that guided their military and political decisions. These weren't legends or myths, but practical texts, consulted before battles and during political negotiations. The Samnites fought Rome across 3 brutal wars spanning 50 years. They coordinated multi-city confederations, maintained supply lines through mountainous terrain, and adapted tactics to counter Roman strategies. That level of organization requires written knowledge, military manuals, strategic analyses, records of past engagements. None of those texts survive, but the references to them do, preserved in Roman histories that mention Samnite practices while describing their eventual defeat. Messapian inscriptions in southern Italy include astronomical notations, observations of celestial events recorded with dates and descriptions. Later, Roman writers mention that Messapian priests could predict eclipses, a capability that requires systematic observation over generations and mathematical models to calculate future events. The inscriptions we have are fragmentary, but they hint at a larger body of astronomical knowledge. Sabine herbal medicine became famous in Rome. Romans adopted Sabine remedies for various ailments, incorporated Sabine agricultural techniques, followed Sabine wisdom about when to plant based on stellar positions. What survives are the practices divorced from their origins, claimed as traditional Roman knowledge, without acknowledgement of their actual source. That agricultural calendar, discovered in 1851, a fragment of text embedded in a larger manuscript, revealed something Romans had forgotten. The planting schedule they followed wasn't based on Roman observation, but on Sabine stellar calculations developed centuries before Rome existed. The Sabines had tracked relationships between star positions and seasonal weather patterns, creating a calendar that optimized crop yields based on accumulated data spanning generations. The Vatican Archives contain medieval manuscripts that include these scattered references. A monk copying Pliny's Natural History preserves a paragraph about Oscan bronze-working techniques. Another copying Livy's history includes a description of Lucanian democratic practices that influenced Roman political thought. A third, working through Varro fragments quoted by a church father, preserves a sentence about Venetic funeral rituals. The preservation is accidental. Medieval scribes weren't interested in pre-Roman Italian cultures. They were copying works valued for other reasons: Christian apologetics, classical rhetoric, historical chronicles. But embedded in those valued texts were fragments of information about peoples whose own writings had vanished. Modern scholars work like archaeologists, cross-referencing a mention in one text with a fragmentary inscription found at an excavation site, using linguistic analysis to reconstruct meanings from related languages, building understanding from pieces that individually seem insignificant. The accumulated evidence suggests something Roman propaganda obscured. The peoples Rome conquered weren't primitive tribes waiting for civilization. They had sophisticated knowledge systems, astronomical observations that required mathematical calculation, medical practices based on systematic experimentation, agricultural techniques refined over centuries. social organizations that operated through consensus and confederation rather than autocratic rule. Rome absorbed this knowledge, often without crediting its sources. Later generations of Romans used techniques and followed practices whose origins they no longer remembered, calling them ancestral wisdom, without knowing which ancestors or whose wisdom. Somewhere in those climate-controlled vaults, in manuscripts catalogued for entirely different purposes, fragments of these other worlds wait. Not the complete picture that's gone, but enough pieces to glimpse what existed before Rome unified Italy and rewrote its history. When Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, it didn't just acquire grain and gold. It acquired access to knowledge systems that were already 3,000 years old. The ancient Mediterranean wasn't a collection of isolated cultures. It was a web, interconnected by routes that carried not just goods but ideas, technologies, and texts. Ships moved constantly across waters that we think of as barriers, but that ancient peoples treated as highways. Puteoli, the port near modern Naples, received vessels from Alexandria loaded with Egyptian grain to feed Rome's population. But those ships also carried papyrus, not just the blank sheets Romans used for writing, but finished scrolls, books copied in Egyptian scriptoria, and brought north for sale to Roman collectors. In the markets of Puteoli, you could buy produce from Africa alongside philosophical treatises from Greece, medical texts from Egyptian physicians, astronomical observations from Babylonian scholars, copied and recopied across centuries. Brundisium, where the Via Appia met the Adriatic, connected Rome to the eastern Mediterranean. Ships from Greece, Asia Minor, and beyond unloaded there. Scholars travelled these routes, carrying their knowledge with them. A philosopher from Athens might journey to Rome seeking a patron. A physician from Ephesus might establish a practice treating wealthy Romans. They brought books, techniques, accumulated wisdom from their home cities. Syracuse in Sicily stood at the crossroads of multiple influences. Greek in culture, it had traded with Carthaginians, interacted with native Sicilian peoples, and eventually fell to Rome. Its libraries contained works in multiple languages, texts that represented the mixing of traditions that occurred wherever cultures met and exchanged. These weren't just contemporary exchanges. The knowledge flowing along these routes already carried layers of history. When Rome conquered Greece in 146 BCE, it acquired access to Greek libraries that themselves preserved older wisdom. Greek scholars had studied in Egypt, learned from Babylonian astronomers, incorporated observations and techniques from civilizations that predated classical Greece by centuries. Caesar's campaigns in Egypt brought Rome into contact with the Library of Alexandria, though what exactly that contact meant remains debated. Did Roman scholars gain access to its holdings? Were texts copied and sent to Rome? The library contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, many of them copies of even older Egyptian texts, medical knowledge refined over millennia, astronomical observations spanning dynasties. When the kingdom of Pergamum was annexed in 133 BCE, its famous library, second only to Alexandria, became Roman property. That collection included not just Greek works but texts from across the Hellenistic world, the accumulated knowledge of kingdoms stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Rome became a repository by conquest. Each absorbed territory brought its archives, its scholarly collections, its preserved wisdom. The pattern repeated across the expanding empire. Knowledge flowed toward Rome, concentrated in libraries owned by wealthy collectors, consulted by scholars, copied by scribes. But it wasn't just texts that travelled. The material forms of knowledge themselves evolved through these exchanges. Papyrus from Egypt provided the primary writing surface for centuries. Wax tablets served for daily administration and temporary notes. Parchment, developed in Pergamum, eventually revolutionized bookmaking more durable than papyrus, allowing texts to survive in climates where papyrus would decay. The interconnections create layers that stretch back beyond classical civilization. Rome inherited Greek knowledge, but Greek knowledge itself inherited from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Phoenicia. Egyptian texts copied older Egyptian wisdom, preserving traditions that predated the pyramids. Greek astronomical works incorporated Babylonian observations spanning centuries. Phoenician records preserved Canaanite traditions from before alphabet development. Each civilization became a curator of what came before, preserving knowledge systems they hadn't created but recognized as valuable. And Rome, by conquering these civilizations, inherited the entire accumulated chain. When Christianity became Rome's official religion and the Church inherited imperial infrastructure, It also inherited this role as knowledge curator. The Vatican became the endpoint of a trajectory that stretched back through Rome, to Greece, to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, to civilizations whose names we've forgotten. Somewhere in those climate-controlled chambers, in manuscripts catalogued under Greek philosophy, or Roman history, or medieval theology, there might be fragments of knowledge systems that trace back 3, 4, 5,000 years, not always labelled, not always recognized for what they are, but preserved nonetheless. Because knowledge, once committed to writing, can survive the civilization that created it. It just needs someone to keep copying it forward, generation after generation, even without fully understanding what they're preserving. A Greek medical text from the 2nd century CE claims its techniques for setting broken bones came from the priests of Memphis, who learned from those before them. The text is in the Vatican Library. The Egyptian source it cites has never been found. Rome's relationship with Greek culture was complicated by contradiction. Romans saw themselves as politically and militarily superior. They had conquered Greece, after all, absorbed its territories into empire. Yet they simultaneously viewed Greeks as culturally superior in philosophy, science, art, literature. This created a peculiar dynamic. Roman generals pillaged Greek cities while Roman aristocrats paid Greek tutors to educate their children. Greek knowledge flowed to Rome through multiple channels. Libraries in Athens, Rhodes, and Alexandria were consulted, their holdings sometimes copied, sometimes simply taken. Greek scholars migrated to Rome, establishing themselves as physicians, teachers, and advisors to wealthy families. They brought not just their personal expertise but their books, medical treatises, philosophical dialogues, mathematical proofs, astronomical observations. The extent of what Rome absorbed is staggering. Scientific works by Aristotle cataloguing the natural world, Euclid's geometry, which would shape mathematical thinking for 2 millennia, Archimedes' engineering principles and calculations. Medical texts by Hippocrates, establishing systematic approaches to diagnosis and treatment, later expanded by Galen into comprehensive theories of human physiology. Astronomical observations and mathematical models for predicting celestial movements. Philosophical schools, Platonism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, each offering frameworks for understanding existence and ethics. Historical works covering not just Greek city-states but the entire Mediterranean world as Greeks understood it. Herodotus travelling and documenting cultures from Egypt to Scythia, Thucydides analysing war with systematic rigour, later historians chronicling Alexander's campaigns to India and the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed. But here's the layer that deepens everything. The Greeks themselves were inheritors, not originators. Greek natural philosophy incorporated astronomical observations from Babylonia, mathematical techniques developed over centuries by Mesopotamian scholars tracking celestial patterns. Greek medicine drew explicitly on Egyptian traditions. The Hippocratic texts acknowledge learning from Egyptian physicians whose lineages stretched back through dynasties. Greek geometry evolved from Egyptian surveying techniques, practical methods for measuring land after Nile floods that were formalized into abstract mathematical proofs. The Greeks acknowledged these debts. Sometimes. Pythagoras was said to have studied in Egypt, learning from priests who guarded ancient wisdom. Plato's account of Atlantis came supposedly from Egyptian priests who told Solon about civilizations that predated Greece by thousands of years. Democritus claimed to have learned from Babylonian magi, studying their observations of nature and cosmos. Whether these specific accounts are literally accurate matters less than what they reveal. Greeks saw themselves as part of a longer chain of knowledge transmission. They preserved and built upon what came before, adding their own insights but recognizing they weren't starting from nothing. When Rome acquired Greek knowledge, it was also indirectly acquiring this Eastern heritage. A Greek astronomical text might contain Babylonian observations. A Greek medical manual might preserve Egyptian techniques. A Greek philosophical dialogue might reference wisdom traditions from Persia or India. Medieval Christian scholars approached this inheritance with ambivalence. They valued practical knowledge, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, but viewed pagan philosophy with suspicion. Greek works were preserved selectively, copied in monasteries, where monks recognized their utility, while sometimes adding marginal notes, warning against their theological errors. The Vatican became a major center for preserving Greek manuscripts. Byzantine donations before and after Constantinople's fall brought thousands of texts west. Renaissance collectors eagerly sought Greek works, and many of those collections eventually found their way into church holdings. What this means is that embedded in Greek texts preserved in the Vatican Archives are potential fragments of even older knowledge, references to Egyptian sources that no longer exist, quotations from Babylonian astronomical texts known only through Greek summaries, descriptions of techniques attributed to ancient wisdom keepers whose original writings have vanished. The Greek texts are catalogued, studied, known, but the layers beneath them, the Eastern sources Greeks cited, the older traditions they built upon those, remain largely unexplored, visible only as shadows within the better documented Greek inheritance. Sometimes the shadow is all that survives of what once cast it. Rome destroyed every building in Carthage, killed or enslaved every citizen. Yet somewhere, a Roman senator kept Mago's farming manual. The question is, what else did they keep? Carthage began as a Phoenician colony on the North African coast and became an empire. At its height, it controlled territories from modern Tunisia across North Africa to Morocco, dominated Spain, held Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica. Its navy was the most powerful in the Western Mediterranean, its ships built with engineering techniques that gave them advantages in speed and maneuverability. Carthaginian traders established routes reaching to Britain for tin, down the African coast for gold and ivory, across the Mediterranean to every port that would receive them. This was Rome's greatest rival. Not a barbarian tribe to be easily conquered, but a sophisticated civilization with comparable military strength, superior naval capacity, and commercial networks that dwarfed Rome's early trade. The conflict between them spanned more than a century. 3 separate wars, famous battles, and legendary figures, Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants to bring war directly to Italy. The Third Punic War ended it. In 146 BCE, after a siege that lasted 3 years, Roman forces breached Carthage's walls. What followed was systematic destruction. The city burned for 17 days. Survivors were killed or sold into slavery. Buildings were demolished down to their foundations. Later writers claimed Romans salted the earth so nothing would grow there, probably apocryphal. But the story captures the totality of the erasure Rome intended. And here's the silence that should disturb us. Carthage was a literate civilization. They had writing, libraries, archives, scholars. They recorded their history, their commercial transactions, their religious practices, their accumulated knowledge. Yet almost nothing survives in their own voice. What we know about Carthage comes almost entirely from their enemies, Greek historians who viewed them as barbaric commercial competitors, Roman writers who cast them as existential threats justifying their complete destruction. We see Carthage through hostile eyes, described by people who had every reason to distort, to simplify, to demonize. But here's the paradox that creates the mystery. Romans, who destroyed Carthage so completely that its exact location was debated for centuries, also claim to have preserved some Carthaginian knowledge. Mago's agricultural treatise was a 28-volume work on farming written in Punic. Romans valued it highly enough to have it translated into Latin and Greek. Roman agricultural writers Varro, Columella, Pliny quote from it repeatedly, citing Mago's techniques for viticulture, olive cultivation, livestock management. The original Punic text is lost. The Latin translation survives only in fragments, sentences preserved because later writers found them useful enough to quote. But it wasn't just Mago. There are references to other Carthaginian texts that Romans consulted, Punic religious texts that were studied. Though Romans officially despised Carthaginian religion, commercial records that were examined to understand trade networks Rome wanted to control. Navigation techniques that were adopted because Carthaginian sailors knew the Western Mediterranean better than anyone. Why would Rome preserve anything from a civilization they hated enough to erase from existence? The answer seems to be purely practical. Carthaginian knowledge was useful. Their agricultural techniques worked in similar Mediterranean climates. Their understanding of North African terrain and weather patterns proved valuable when Rome inherited those territories. Their navigation skills, developed over centuries of commercial voyaging, were superior to Rome's. Their commercial practices offered lessons worth studying. Utility trumped ideology. Knowledge survived when it served the conqueror's interests, regardless of its source. Which raises the possibility, if Romans preserved Mago's farming manual despite destroying everything else Carthaginian, what other texts might they have kept? What fragments might have been filed away in Roman archives, labeled not as Carthaginian but simply as practical knowledge, sources forgotten as their utility was absorbed into Roman practice? When those Roman archives eventually passed to the Church, Carthaginian fragments might have come with them, unrecognized, uncatalogued as Punic, simply preserved as part of the vast accumulation of texts. Somewhere in the silence, voices might still wait. A 12th century Vatican manuscript contains a list of lunar eclipses. Modern astronomers ran the calculations backward. The observations were made in 673 BCE, from a location in Etruria. The ancients watched the sky with an intensity we've mostly lost. Not casually, not romantically, but systematically. They tracked the movements of planets across the background of stars, noted when and where eclipses occurred, measured the length of the year with precision that approaches modern accuracy. The Babylonians developed mathematical models to predict celestial events centuries before the Greeks. They recognized that planetary movements followed patterns, cycles that repeated with regularity, sufficient to allow calculation forward or backward in time. Their tablets, inscribed in cuneiform, contain predictions of eclipses, planetary positions, stellar risings, observations accumulated over generations, and refined into predictive science. The Egyptians created a solar calendar more accurate than the lunar-based systems most ancient cultures used. They recognized that the year was approximately 365 days, divided it into 12 months, and added extra days to keep their calendar aligned with the seasons. This wasn't guesswork. It required observing the annual flooding of the Nile, tracking the rising of certain stars, maintaining records across decades to verify patterns. Greek astronomers built on these foundations. Hipparchus calculated the length of the year to within 6 minutes of the measurement we use today. He created a catalogue of over 800 stars, noting their positions with sufficient accuracy that modern astronomers can identify which stars he was observing. This level of precision required systematic observation, mathematical sophistication, and the ability to account for various sources of error. Rome inherited all of this. Etruscan priests had their own sky-watching traditions, interpreting meaning from lightning and bird flight, but also tracking celestial patterns. Greek astronomical knowledge came through conquest and cultural absorption. Egyptian calendar systems were studied and sometimes adopted. Babylonian techniques for prediction reached Rome through Greek intermediaries. But astronomy wasn't abstract science conducted for its own sake. It was essential technology. Agriculture depended on knowing when to plant and harvest, cycles determined by solar and stellar positions. Navigation required celestial positioning, the ability to determine direction and latitude by observing stars and planets. Religious observances needed accurate calendars to maintain festival schedules. Civil administration required standardized timekeeping. This practical necessity meant astronomical knowledge was preserved even through periods of cultural disruption. Medieval monasteries, far from suppressing ancient astronomy, were its primary European preservers. Monks needed accurate calendars to observe religious festivals. Easter's date required complex calculations involving solar years, lunar months, and the spring equinox. So they maintained astronomical tables, copied calculation methods, preserved the techniques that allowed them to continue the practices their faith required. The Vatican collections contain manuscripts with astronomical content that traces back through this long chain of preservation. Eclipse predictions attributed to ancient sources, tables for calculating planetary positions based on Babylonian parameters, descriptions of constellation systems that predate Ptolemy's standardized star catalogue. Some of these manuscripts contain something particularly interesting: observational data rather than calculated predictions. Someone actually watched specific celestial events and recorded what they saw, the time, the position, the appearance. These aren't theoretical calculations, but empirical observations made from specific locations at specific moments in history. Modern astronomers have learned to read these observations backward. Celestial mechanics are consistent and predictable. If you know where the stars and planets are now, you can calculate where they were at any point in the past. If a manuscript describes an eclipse occurring at a certain time with the moon in a certain constellation, you can determine when and where that observation must have been made. This has led to surprising discoveries. Astronomical data in medieval manuscripts that appears to be observational rather than calculated sometimes predates the manuscript itself by centuries. A 12th century copy contains observations that could only have been made in the 7th century BCE. The manuscript is a copy, obviously, but a copy of what? Of another copy? Of an original observation recorded more than 1800 years before the copy we have? The implications ripple outward. Somewhere in the chain of transmission, actual observational data from ancient Mediterranean civilizations was preserved. It was copied, because it remained useful. Astronomical observations don't become obsolete the way cultural narratives do. An eclipse recorded accurately in 673 BCE can still be used to verify calendar calculations in the 12th century CE. This means fragments of ancient astronomical knowledge, preserved through utility rather than cultural reverence, might exist scattered through Vatican manuscripts, not always recognized for what they are, not always catalogued as ancient observations, but present nonetheless. Data points waiting for someone with the right tools to recognize them, calculate backward, and discover that they're looking at knowledge from civilizations that watched the same sky we do, recording what they saw with care and precision that has survived the centuries. A Vatican medical manuscript from the 802nd CE describes treating infection with a bread mold poultice. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. The manuscript's source is listed as Ancient Authorities. Ancient medicine wasn't a single tradition, but a convergence of multiple systems, each developed through centuries of observation, experimentation, and accumulated experience. Egyptian medicine combined practical surgery with ritual practice. Their physicians could set broken bones, suture wounds, perform basic surgical procedures. They developed specialized instruments for different operations, created pharmaceutical preparations from hundreds of plants and minerals, maintained medical libraries in temple complexes where knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations. Yet their practice also incorporated magical incantations and religious invocations, seeing disease as both physical and spiritual. Greek Hippocratic medicine took a different approach, emphasizing observation and natural causation. Disease wasn't divine punishment, but the result of imbalances in the body's humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Treatment focused on restoring balance through diet, rest, herbal remedies, and limited surgical intervention. The Hippocratic texts documented symptoms, described disease progression, recorded which treatments worked and which didn't. This was empirical medicine, learning through systematic observation. Etruscan healing practices blended herbal knowledge with religious ritual. Archaeological evidence suggests they understood basic anatomy, performed dental procedures, created prosthetics. Roman sources mention Etruscan physicians who combined practical treatment with divination practices, reading health through natural signs. Various Italian tribes maintained their own folk medicine, traditions, herbal remedies passed through generations, techniques for treating common injuries and illnesses, plant knowledge specific to their regions. Rome became the crossroads where all these traditions met. Greek doctors dominated the medical profession in Roman cities, bringing Hippocratic theory and Greek pharmaceutical knowledge. But they incorporated techniques from across the Mediterranean. Egyptian surgical procedures, Etruscan herbal preparations, local Italian remedies, whatever worked was adopted, regardless of origin. Major medical texts were written during the Roman period, compiling and synthesizing this accumulated knowledge. Galen's anatomical works, based on animal dissection, since human dissection was prohibited, described physiological systems with accuracy that would remain authoritative for over 1,000 years. Dioscorides catalogued 600 medicinal plants in his De Materia Medica, describing their properties, preparation methods, and therapeutic uses. Celsus de Medicina preserved both Greek medical theory and the practical surgery developed in Roman military medicine. Countless smaller works address specific conditions, eye diseases, gynecological issues, surgical techniques, pharmaceutical recipes. This vast medical literature represented centuries of accumulated practical knowledge. When the Roman Empire fragmented, monasteries became the primary preservers of medical knowledge. Monastic infirmaries maintained medical manuscripts, cultivated herb gardens with medicinal plants, and cared for sick travelers and community members. Monks copied medical texts alongside religious works, recognizing that healing was part of their spiritual mission. But medieval medical manuscripts aren't simple copies. They're palimpsests, texts copied and recopied, with each generation adding observations from their own practice and sometimes removing material deemed irrelevant or outdated. This created layers, with older knowledge embedded within newer compilations. What might be hidden in those layers? Ancient recipes attributed to Egyptian or Greek sources that no longer exist independently. Surgical techniques described in texts now lost, preserved only as fragments in later compilations. Herbal remedies from Italian folk traditions that were incorporated into broader medical practice and then attributed to more prestigious classical sources. Specific examples exist in Vatican holdings. A 9th century manuscript contains a section on wound treatment according to the Etruscan method, describing techniques that differ from standard Greek or Roman approaches. A collection of pharmaceutical recipes is attributed to physicians of Alexandria in a context suggesting pre-Islamic transmission. Descriptions of surgical instruments appear that match archaeological finds from Etruscan sites, but aren't mentioned in widely circulated Roman medical texts. Medical knowledge was preserved across cultural and religious boundaries for a simple reason: practical necessity. A technique that stopped bleeding worked regardless of whether it came from pagan Etruscans or Christian monks. An herbal remedy that reduced fever remained effective whether its discoverer worshipped Jupiter or Christ. Medical practice required results, and results came from accumulated experience regardless of source. This created unusual preservation patterns. Religious texts might be destroyed or suppressed based on theological concerns, but medical knowledge survived if it proved useful. A bread mold poultice that prevented wound infection would be copied into medical manuscripts century after century, attributed to ancient authorities whose specific identities had been forgotten, preserved through utility rather than cultural reverence. Embedded in medieval medical manuscripts might be fragments of pre-Roman Italian healing practices, Egyptian pharmaceutical knowledge, Greek surgical techniques, herbal wisdom from cultures whose names we no longer remember. Not always attributed correctly, not always understood fully, but preserved, because when someone was sick or injured, what mattered was what worked. And sometimes, what worked in the 8th century would be rediscovered and validated in the 20th. The Sibylline books, Rome's most sacred prophetic texts, were kept in the Temple of Jupiter and consulted only in crisis. When the temple burned, the prophecies vanished, or so Rome claimed. A 15th century catalogue lists Sibylline fragments, authentic in a Vatican subcollection. Why would the Catholic Church preserve pagan religious texts? The question contains a paradox that reveals something important about how knowledge actually survives across cultural transformations. The answers are multiple and layered. Church fathers needed to understand what they were arguing against. You can't effectively refute pagan philosophy or religious practice without knowing what those systems actually taught. This created a scholarly motivation for preservation. Study your opponent's position thoroughly before dismantling it. Some Christian thinkers believed that pagan wisdom, while ultimately misguided, contained fragments of universal truth. These fragments pointed toward Christianity, they argued, like incomplete revelations waiting for completion. This theological position created space for preserving pagan, philosophical, and mystical texts as examples of humanity groping toward truth before Christ's revelation. There were practical considerations too. Newly converted populations didn't immediately abandon all their previous practices. Understanding local pagan traditions helped church authorities recognize which folk customs were harmless and which needed active suppression. This required documentation. You had to know what the practices actually were. And some classical texts containing pagan religious content also contained valuable historical, philosophical, or scientific material. You couldn't preserve Plato's philosophy without also preserving his discussions of Greek religious concepts. You couldn't keep Roman historical chronicles without encountering detailed descriptions of pagan rituals and beliefs. The types of religious knowledge that were documented are remarkably diverse. Mystery religion initiation rites, Eleusinian, Orphic, Mithraic, were described in various sources, sometimes by participants who later became Christian, sometimes by hostile observers, sometimes by curious scholars recording exotic practices. Divination systems received extensive documentation. Etruscan haruspicy with its elaborate interpretation of animal organs, Greek oracle procedures, Roman augury reading meaning in bird flight and thunder. Magical papyri from Egypt contained spells, invocations, ritual procedures for various purposes. Many ended up in collections that eventually made their way to Rome. Philosophical religious systems like Neoplatonism blended abstract metaphysics with mystical practice in ways that early Christian theologians found both fascinating and troubling. Temple rituals, sacrifice procedures, festival practices from across the Mediterranean were recorded in historical and ethnographic works. Church fathers quoted pagan sources extensively while refuting them. Augustine cited Varro's descriptions of Roman religious practices at length, preserving information that would otherwise be lost when Varro's original works disappeared. The act of refutation became the mechanism of preservation, copying pagan texts into Christian arguments against them, inadvertently saving them for future generations. Medieval copyists sometimes preserved curious pagan material in manuscript margins, or included it in larger encyclopedic works. A monk, copying a philosophical treatise, might add a marginal note about a ritual practice mentioned in another text he'd encountered. These fragments accumulated across centuries of copying and annotation. Certain pagan texts received special treatment because early Christians saw them as prophecies of Christ. Virgil's fourth eclogue, speaking of a child who would usher in a golden age, was interpreted as predicting Jesus. This made Virgil's work not just acceptable but theologically significant. The Sibylline oracles, originally Greek and Roman prophetic texts, were Christianized through selective editing and reinterpretation, then preserved as examples of pagan prophecy fulfilled by Christian revelation. This created unusual motivation for maintaining pagan prophetic literature. If these texts predicted Christ, they validated Christian claims about Jesus' cosmic significance. Ancient prophecies became evidence in theological arguments, which meant they needed to be preserved, studied, and cited. The Vatican collections likely contain fragments from pre-Roman Italian religious cults, mystery religion teachings, descriptions of practices that no longer exist anywhere else, mystical writings from ancient Mediterranean cultures, not always clearly labeled, not always recognized for what they are, but present within larger manuscripts that were preserved for other reasons. The paradox resolves into complexity. Knowledge wasn't preserved or destroyed based on simple criteria. It survived through multiple motivations: refutation, appropriation, reinterpretation, scholarly curiosity, theological argument, historical documentation. Sometimes the very act of condemning something required preserving it long enough to explain what made it condemnable. And sometimes, what was preserved as an example of error or as a prophecy pointing elsewhere becomes valuable simply as a window into worlds that would otherwise remain completely silent. The Vatican Index prohibited 20,000 titles. Scholars with permission could still read them. The question isn't what was banned, it's what required permission, and why some permissions were never granted. In 1559, the Catholic Church established the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Prohibited Books. It would be maintained, updated, and enforced for over 4 centuries, not abolished until 1966. The index catalogued books Catholics were forbidden to read without special dispensation: heretical works, Protestant theology, scientific texts that contradicted church teaching, literature deemed immoral or corrupting. The index wasn't primarily concerned with ancient texts. Most prohibited works were contemporary, dangerous in the 16th century, meant writings by Luther and Calvin, not fragments from pre-Roman Italy. But the index represented a broader principle, that certain knowledge was dangerous and should be restricted. This principle affected how ancient texts were handled. Some classical works were prohibited outright, or permitted only in censored editions, with passages deemed immoral or heretical physically removed. Ovid's love poetry was available, but only in versions where explicit passages had been inked over or cut out. Philosophical works that contradicted Christian theology required careful editing or extensive footnotes explaining their errors. But censorship didn't mean destruction. The censored materials, the removed passages, the prohibited interpretations, the dangerous ideas didn't disappear. They were often preserved in restricted collections, accessible only to scholars who could demonstrate legitimate research purposes and whose faith was considered strong enough to withstand exposure to error. The Vatican Library maintains levels of access to this day. Certain materials require special permission, available only to qualified researchers. Colloquially, some Vatican staff referred to the most restricted section as Inferno, though that was never an official designation. These collections contained works on magic, erotica, extreme heretical positions, materials judged too dangerous for general scholarly access. This created a peculiar situation. The institution that prohibited books for general reading also became their most careful curator. The Vatican might possess texts it officially condemned but valued for research, comparison, or refutation. You couldn't effectively argue against heresy without understanding heretical positions. You couldn't refute magical thinking without studying magical texts. Opposition required knowledge. Specific categories filled these restricted spaces. Grimoires claiming to teach ritual magic. Alchemical treatises promising material and spiritual transformation. Astrological works that went beyond calendar calculation into claims of cosmic determinism that contradicted free will. Philosophical works asserting positions incompatible with Christian doctrine. Among these restricted collections, might be ancient texts that, while not necessarily prohibited by medieval standards, were deemed too dangerous, too confusing, or too potentially heretical for general access. A text describing pre-Roman religious practices in sympathetic terms. A fragment suggesting moral wisdom existed before Christianity. An account presenting pagan civilization as equal or superior to Christian culture. The psychology of forbidden knowledge reveals something important about institutions and human nature. The same organizations that prohibited books often collected them most avidly. Partly this was the desire to understand and refute error. You had to know what you were arguing against. Partly it was intellectual curiosity that transcended dogmatic boundaries. Forbidden knowledge attracts, precisely because it's forbidden. And partly it was fear that knowledge once lost could never be recovered. Prohibition creates strange preservation patterns. A book banned from circulation but kept in restricted collections might survive centuries precisely because it was dangerous enough to control but too valuable to destroy. Meanwhile, innocuous texts that anyone could read might disappear through neglect, copied less frequently because they weren't protected by the attention that prohibition brings. This means that within Vatican collections, tiered by levels of access, might exist ancient texts that survived specifically because they required restriction, not destroyed, because they contain knowledge worth preserving, not widely accessible, because that knowledge was deemed dangerous to certain audiences. The index listed what was prohibited, but it never listed what required permission but was never actually granted. Those texts exist in a category beyond simple prohibition, too significant to destroy, too dangerous to share, even with scholars who requested them. In 1614, a Vatican librarian noted in his diary, "Found today a Greek papyrus with figures and words unknown, Egyptian perhaps or older, placed it with the uncertain things, for wiser men to judge." Magic and alchemy weren't the province of charlatans and fantasists in the ancient world. They were serious intellectual pursuits, systems of knowledge with their own internal logic, methods, and accumulated traditions. The ancient Mediterranean had rich magical practices. Egyptian papyri contain elaborate spells, invocations to gods and spirits, ritual instructions for everything from healing the sick to cursing enemies to protecting travelers. These weren't hasty scribbles but carefully preserved texts, copied and recopied, refined through generations of practitioners who recorded what worked and what didn't. Greek magical texts often attributed themselves to legendary figures, Hermes Trismegistus, supposed source of pristine ancient wisdom, or Orpheus, the mythical musician whose songs could charm the underworld. These attributions gave authority, suggesting the knowledge traced back to divine or semi-divine origins. Roman collections preserved curses inscribed on lead tablets and buried in graves, protective charms worn as amulets, divination methods for reading the future through various means. When Rome absorbed other Italian peoples, it absorbed their magical practices too. Etruscan techniques for reading omens, Sabine protective rituals, regional variations in how different cultures approached the unseen forces they believed shaped reality. Early Christianity had a complicated relationship with all of this. It condemned pagan magic as demonic deception, while attributing miraculous powers to Christian saints and relics. This created definitional debates that consumed theological energy. What separated magic from miracle? Divine power from demonic manipulation? Acceptable prayer from forbidden invocation? The boundary was never entirely clear, which meant magical texts survived in unexpected ways. Medieval scribes copied them despite official prohibition, fascinated by the mysterious symbols, the exotic rituals, the promise of hidden knowledge. They justified preservation through various rationalizations, understanding what to condemn, documenting error, satisfying intellectual curiosity under the guise of scholarship. The Hermetic corpus became enormously influential during the Renaissance. These were Greek philosophical and magical texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, supposedly ancient Egyptian wisdom predating Moses himself. In reality, they were Hellenistic-era compositions, but Renaissance scholars didn't know that. They believed they possessed pristine knowledge from humanity's earliest civilizations, mystical truths encoded before they could be corrupted. Alchemy presented itself as both material and spiritual practice. Ancient practitioners weren't simply trying to turn lead into gold through primitive chemistry. They understood their work as transformation, purifying base matter, while simultaneously purifying the soul, achieving material and spiritual perfection through parallel processes. Alchemical texts encoded knowledge in symbolic language, deliberate obscurity designed to preserve secrets from the uninitiated. Later readers found this cryptic quality endlessly fascinating. Specific texts circulated, claimed ancient origins, and eventually found their way into various collections. The Picatrix, a medieval Latin translation of an Arabic magical text, claimed to transmit ancient wisdom about celestial magic and planetary influences. The Key of Solomon, attributed to the biblical king renowned for wisdom, contained detailed ritual magic instructions. Various grimoires, books of magical procedure, circulated throughout medieval Europe, many claiming Egyptian, Greek, or Hebrew origins to establish authority. What might exist in restricted Vatican collections? Original Greek magical papyri, acquired from Egypt during various periods of collecting. Medieval copies of ancient spells and rituals, preserved despite prohibition. Alchemical manuscripts from diverse traditions. Egyptian, Greek, Arabic, European, each claiming to preserve primordial knowledge. Texts that blended pagan religious practices with magical techniques in ways that made them theologically problematic but intellectually compelling. The Church preserved these materials while restricting access for multiple reasons. Opposition required understanding. You couldn't effectively argue against magical thinking without studying magical texts. Ancient belief systems had scholarly value regardless of theological position, and even devout Christians felt the fascination these mysterious texts exerted, the pull of forbidden knowledge promising secrets about reality's hidden workings. Among these materials might be genuine pre-Roman Italian magical practices, fragments of Etruscan ritual texts describing divination procedures or protective ceremonies, ancient mystery religion, instructions that later magical compilations absorbed and claimed as their own ancient authority. The uncertain things, waiting for wiser judgment. Sometimes wisdom means recognizing that understanding requires preserving what you don't entirely approve of, that knowledge has value independent of agreement. And sometimes the uncertain things remain uncertain, precisely because certainty would force uncomfortable decisions. Livy claimed to have consulted Etruscan sources for his Roman history. His account of the Etruscan kings is detailed, specific, and contradicts the Roman propaganda about defeating barbarians. The sources he cited haven't been found. Yet, history has never been just an academic exercise. In the ancient world and through the medieval period, how you told the past shaped how people understood the present and imagined the future. Historical narratives legitimized power, justified conquest, established the inevitability of current arrangements, which meant certain historical claims became dangerous. Texts that contradicted official Roman founding myths threatened the ideological foundation Rome built its identity upon. If Rome's origins weren't uniquely virtuous, if the city's rise wasn't divinely ordained or the result of superior character, then Roman dominance became accident rather than destiny. Alternative origin stories weren't just different, they were destabilizing. Accounts that portrayed early Christianity differently than Orthodox doctrine created theological problems. The early church wasn't monolithic. Different communities practiced differently, emphasized different aspects of Jesus' teaching, interpreted scripture in conflicting ways. As orthodoxy consolidated, these variations became heresies. Historical records preserving them became evidence of error that needed careful management. Histories that elevated pagan civilizations presented a different kind of danger. If pre-Christian peoples had achieved remarkable sophistication in philosophy, science, art, and governance, it complicated narratives about Christianity bringing enlightenment to darkness. Acknowledging that pagans possessed genuine wisdom required nuanced theological positions that not everyone was equipped to navigate. Records challenging papal authority or church institutional claims had obvious political sensitivity. Documents suggesting different power structures in early Christianity, or preserving accounts of church councils where decisions went differently than official histories claimed, threatened contemporary arrangements built on particular versions of the past. How were these sensitivities managed? Selective copying allowed problematic sections to simply disappear when texts were reproduced. A scribe copying a historical chronicle might skip passages that contradicted current orthodoxy, and if the original was then lost, the omission became invisible. Commentary and interpretation provided another approach. Preserve the problematic text, but surround it with annotations, explaining why it's wrong, contextualizing it within orthodox frameworks, neutralizing its dangerous potential through layers of approved interpretation. Restricted access meant preservation without circulation. Keep the text because it's historically valuable, but limit who can read it to scholars whose faith and judgment are trusted. Tacitus's accounts of early Germanic tribes became politically charged during the Renaissance, when some readers used them to construct non-Roman European heritage, challenging the narrative of Roman civilization as Europe's sole legitimate ancestor. Pre-Christian Roman religious practices were both condemned and carefully studied, creating a category of knowledge that was simultaneously forbidden and necessary. Christian heresies were preserved specifically to refute them, but those refutations required detailed preservation of the heretical claims themselves. The question of pre-Roman Italian histories carries particular weight. If extensive Etruscan historical records survived into Roman times and were then preserved through medieval copying, they might complicate narratives of inevitable Roman dominance and Christian destiny. An account showing sophisticated Etruscan civilization that Rome conquered and absorbed rather than civilized and elevated would challenge foundational myths. Livy's references to Etruscan sources suggest such materials existed in his time. His descriptions of the Etruscan kings who ruled early Rome are too detailed, too specific, too sympathetic to be pure invention. He was clearly working from sources that portrayed Etruscans as Rome's cultural superiors during the monarchy period. Sophisticated urbanites who taught Rome rather than barbarians Rome civilized. Those sources haven't been found in accessible collections, but haven't been found and don't exist aren't the same thing. Within Vatican Archives might be historical texts, presenting alternative narratives of Mediterranean civilization, preserving accounts of pre-Roman achievements, offering perspectives that official histories marginalized or suppressed. Not destroyed because historical evidence has value, not widely accessible because some truths complicate comfortable narratives. Preserved but protected, documented but restricted, available but only to those trusted to contextualize properly. Pope Nicholas V, who established the Vatican Library in 1448, was asked why he collected pagan texts. His answer: truth cannot be threatened by error, only ignorance can. There's a fundamental human tendency that transcends ideology and era. We collect knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, even knowledge that contradicts our deepest beliefs. Understanding this tendency explains why institutions preserve what they officially oppose. Intellectual curiosity operates independent of approval. Theologians studying heresies to refute them often developed sophisticated understanding of alternative positions. You can't effectively argue against something you don't comprehend. This required reading heretical texts carefully, engaging with their logic, understanding their appeal. In the process, some scholars developed grudging appreciation for the intellectual rigor of positions they ultimately rejected. The texts survived because opposition demanded preservation. There's also the insurance principle, the fear that destroying a text means losing information forever, even if its current value seems negative. Medieval scholars had witnessed catastrophic loss. Classical texts disappeared during barbarian invasions, libraries burned, manuscripts decayed through neglect. They understood viscerally that knowledge, once destroyed, might never be recovered. This created caution about deliberate destruction. Better to preserve and restrict than to obliterate and risk permanent loss. Practical utility complicated ideological purity. Even pagan or heretical texts might contain useful information. Astronomical observations from pagan sources helped calculate Easter's date, which required complex coordination of solar and lunar calendars. Medical recipes from non-Christian traditions worked effectively, regardless of their origin's theological status. Agricultural techniques from ancient sources improved crop yields. When something proved practically valuable, its ideological problems became negotiable. Scholarly integrity demanded that refutation preserve what it refuted. You couldn't argue against a position without accurately representing it. Misrepresenting opponents' views to make them easier to defeat was intellectually dishonest. This principle meant preserving texts even when you disagreed with them fundamentally, maintaining accurate versions so that opposition remained fair and rigorous. The transformation principle offered another justification. Just as pagan temples were converted to churches, the physical structure preserved but repurposed for Christian worship, pagan wisdom could be converted to Christian use with proper interpretation and context. This created space for preserving ancient knowledge by reframing it. Egyptian astronomical observations became evidence of human reason seeking divine order. Greek philosophical insights became preparation for Christian revelation. Pre-Roman wisdom became examples of natural law accessible even to pagans. These motivations created an institutional culture within the Church that valued preservation despite ideological complications. Historical examples illuminate the pattern. Augustine preserved extensive quotes from pagan philosophers while refuting them, inadvertently ensuring their survival when original texts disappeared. Aquinas engaged seriously with Aristotle and Islamic philosophy to develop Christian theology, incorporating pagan and Muslim insights into Christian frameworks. Renaissance popes collected ancient manuscripts including explicitly pagan texts for Vatican libraries, justifying acquisition through multiple rationalizations. Texts were kept to refute them. Opposition required understanding. They were preserved for scholarly comparison, seeing error clarified truth. They survived in case they contain hidden truths. Wisdom might emerge from unexpected sources. They remained because knowledge should not be lost. Destruction itself was dangerous regardless of content. This mindset would logically apply to pre-Roman materials. Even if Etruscan texts contradicted Roman founding myths, they had historical value. Even if pre-Roman astronomical observations came from pagan sources, they contained accurate data. Even if accounts of sophisticated pre-Christian Italian civilizations complicated narratives about Christianity bringing enlightenment, they represented human achievement worthy of study. The collector's dilemma resolves into acceptance of complexity. Pure ideological consistency would demand destroying anything that contradicts approved narratives. But institutions are run by humans, and humans are curious, cautious about permanent loss, pragmatic about utility, committed to intellectual integrity, and capable of reframing problematic knowledge into acceptable contexts. This creates institutional behavior that seems contradictory from outside, but makes perfect sense from within. The same church that prohibited certain books also collected them most avidly. The same scholars who condemned pagan wisdom also studied it most carefully. The same archives that restricted access to dangerous materials also ensured those materials' preservation. Not hypocrisy, not conspiracy, just the complex reality of institutions wrestling with knowledge that challenges them, choosing preservation over destruction, because humans, even very religious humans with strong ideological commitments, recognize that destroying knowledge is more dangerous than containing it. Truth cannot be threatened by error, only ignorance can. Sometimes the preservation of what you oppose is itself an act of intellectual courage. In 2019, Vatican archivists found a collection labeled 16th century correspondence that actually contained fragments from the 3rd century. They'd been misfiled for 400 years. The question becomes, what else is mislabeled? Ancient knowledge didn't travel through a single, clean pathway from origin to modern archive. It moved through a complex web of transfers, each shaped by conquest, institutional change, accident, and human decision. When Rome conquered a city, standard procedure included confiscating important documents, religious texts, administrative records, and library holdings were brought to Rome and deposited in various locations. The Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill housed one major collection. Private libraries of wealthy Romans contained thousands of scrolls, acquired through conquest, purchase, or gift. Knowledge concentrated in Rome, not through systematic planning, but through the gravitational pull of empire. The transition from republic to empire brought consolidation. Imperial libraries organized and catalogued materials with bureaucratic thoroughness. Translation projects rendered Greek texts into Latin, occasionally tackling other languages when practical need demanded. This created copies, which meant redundancy, which meant survival. A text existing in multiple locations had better odds of outlasting fires, floods, and political upheaval. Christianization of the empire changed everything and nothing. Some pagan libraries were destroyed or damaged during periods of religious conflict, but many were simply absorbed into Christian institutions. The Church inherited Roman imperial infrastructure, including its archives. Preservation continued, though motivations shifted from imperial prestige to theological scholarship and administrative necessity. Monasteries became crucial from the 4th century onward. Benedictine scriptoria systematically copied manuscripts to preserve them. The work was laborious, a single book might take months to copy by hand, but monks saw it as spiritual labor, preserving knowledge as an act of devotion. Irish monasteries maintained classical learning during the early medieval period when continental Europe descended into political fragmentation. Byzantine institutions preserved Greek texts that Western Europe had lost access to, maintaining parallel preservation systems that would eventually reconnect. Specific transmission routes emerge from historical records. Materials flowed from Roman libraries to the papal archive, as the church became Rome's institutional heir. Defunct monasteries transferred holdings to larger religious houses during consolidations. Greek scholars fled westward from Constantinople before and after the Ottoman conquest in 1453, bringing manuscripts with them. Private Renaissance collections ended up in Vatican holdings as wealthy families donated or sold their libraries, seeking preservation that only institutional permanence could provide. Palimpsest creates fascinating possibilities. Parchment was expensive, so old texts were sometimes scraped off and overwritten with new content. The original writing wasn't completely removed. Traces remained in the parchment fibers. Modern imaging technology can recover these underlying texts. This means pre-Roman documents might survive as undertext beneath medieval manuscripts, invisible to catalogers for centuries, but recoverable now. Accidental preservation happened constantly. Texts were used as padding in book bindings, scraps of old manuscripts stuffed inside covers for structural support. Fragments served to repair other manuscripts, patches covering damaged sections. Documents got stored in containers labeled for different contents, filed incorrectly during transfers between locations. The Vatican continues discovering miscatalogued materials. Archivists working through collections find items that aren't what labels claim. Sometimes the mislabeling happened recently, a 20th century error in reorganization. Sometimes it's ancient materials incorrectly identified when first acquired and never re-examined. This creates real possibility. Pre-Roman documents might be present but unrecognized, filed under incorrect categories based on superficial examination. A manuscript catalogued as medieval Latin text might contain fragments in other languages that no one noticed. A collection labeled by donor name, rather than content, might hold materials completely unrelated to its supposed subject. The transmission chain involves intentional preservation and systematic cataloguing, but also chaos, accident, and human error. Knowledge survived through design and through luck, through careful curation, and through simple neglect that meant no one bothered destroying what they also didn't bother examining. Which means the archives contain not just what catalogers knew they were preserving, but also what they didn't recognize, didn't understand, or simply never got around to properly identifying. In 2021, a researcher using ultraviolet imaging on a 9th century manuscript found underlying text in Greek. Beneath that was another layer in a script that matched ancient Etruscan. The translation work is ongoing. Modern discoveries from the Vatican archives aren't the dramatic revelations of popular imagination, lost cities, hidden civilizations, complete libraries of vanished peoples. They're quieter than that, more incremental. But accumulated over decades, these small finds significantly reshape our understanding of ancient knowledge transmission. Palimpsest technology has opened new possibilities. Multispectral imaging allows researchers to see text that was scraped away centuries ago to reuse expensive parchment. Different wavelengths of light reveal traces of ink invisible to the naked eye, recovering words that haven't been read in 1,000 years. While most recovered texts are additional classical works, another fragment of Euclid, a previously unknown letter from Augustine, the technique occasionally reveals surprises, languages that take years to identify, scripts from time periods that don't match the visible manuscript. Layers beneath layers, each one potentially older than the last. Catalogue revision produces steady discoveries. As the Vatican works to digitize and systematically recatalogue its holdings, materials get reclassified. A manuscript labeled 15th century religious text turns out to contain sections from the 8th century. A collection described as papal correspondence includes documents that aren't correspondence at all. Sometimes these revisions reveal that materials are centuries older than previously thought, or come from different geographical origins, or contain content completely unrelated to their catalogue descriptions. Cross-referencing between texts and archives yields unexpected results. Scholars comparing references in known works with actual Vatican holdings sometimes find that manuscripts matching descriptions of lost texts have been there all along, just mislabeled or filed under categories that made them invisible to researchers looking for specific materials. Specific examples illustrate the pattern. In 2014, a researcher found a 16th century manuscript describing Etruscan tomb inscriptions from an excavation near Tarquinia. The manuscript included careful drawings of the inscriptions and notes on their locations. Archaeological teams used these descriptions to identify sites that were subsequently excavated, revealing tombs matching the Renaissance account with remarkable accuracy. A 2008 discovery involved Greek medical texts containing Egyptian anatomical terminology not found in other surviving sources. The vocabulary suggested direct transmission of Egyptian medical knowledge into Greek practice, bypassing the usual assumption that all Egyptian influence came filtered through Greek interpretation. The specific terms implied hands-on training, Egyptian physicians teaching Greek students knowledge passed through demonstration rather than just written text. In 2017, what had been catalogued as a medieval calendar was revealed through detailed analysis to be a copy of a much older astronomical table. The calculations matched observation points in ancient Campania, suggesting the original data was collected from southern Italy centuries before the copy was made. The precision of certain measurements indicated systematic observation over extended periods. Recent years have seen increased access to previously restricted materials. Under Pope Francis, sections of the archives dealing with the medieval Inquisition, the Renaissance period, and the Pius XII era have opened to researchers. While these focus on more recent history, the precedent creates hope for future access to other sensitive collections that might contain older materials. The pattern is incremental discovery. A single page clarifying a previously obscure reference. A fragment confirming the existence of a text that scholars had speculated about. A marginal notation providing a missing link between known sources. Nothing dramatic in isolation, but accumulated over decades of careful scholarship, these finds alter understanding significantly. Continued research and technological advancement promise more discoveries. Materials about pre-Roman civilizations might be in the archives already, waiting for the right scholar with appropriate expertise to identify them. New imaging technologies might reveal texts beneath texts beneath texts, each layer potentially containing fragments from earlier eras. The ongoing translation work on that Etruscan palimpsest represents the current state perfectly. Found, identified, but not yet fully understood. Present but still mysterious. Discovered but not finished. The story continues because the archives continue revealing their contents gradually, layer by careful layer. Rome claimed Romulus founded the city through divine will. Archaeological evidence suggests shepherds and Etruscan engineers built it through gradual development. The Church inherited Rome's archives. Guess which story it preserved. Every empire needs an origin story that justifies its power. Rome's was particularly elaborate. Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the war god Mars, descended from Aeneas, who fled burning Troy. Romulus founded the city in 753 BCE through divine favor and martial prowess, marking boundaries through sacred ritual, establishing institutions through godly guidance. This narrative served crucial political functions. It gave Rome divine origins. The city wasn't an accident but a god's plan. It connected Rome to the prestigious Greek cultural world through the Trojan link, claiming heritage that commanded respect. It established Roman exceptionalism, the principle that Rome was chosen, special, destined for greatness, and it justified expansion as fulfilling divine mandate rather than simple conquest. But the story obscured uncomfortable realities. Archaeological evidence shows Rome emerging gradually from multiple Latin settlements that merged over time. Not a single founding moment, but slow urban development spanning generations. The city's earliest structures show Etruscan engineering techniques, drainage systems, fortifications, temple architecture. These weren't Roman innovations, but Etruscan knowledge applied to a growing settlement. Historical sources, even Roman ones, admit that Etruscan kings ruled early Rome, not Romans conquering Etruscans, but Etruscans governing Romans. The Tarquin dynasty brought urban planning, monumental architecture, sophisticated religious practices. They transformed a collection of hilltop villages into a proper city. Rome didn't civilize the Etruscans civilized Rome. Linguistic evidence reveals heavy borrowing. Religious terminology, political vocabulary, technical terms for engineering and architecture. Much of it came from Etruscan, Sabine, and Greek sources. The Latin language itself shows layers of influence, words absorbed from cultures Rome would later claim to have surpassed. For centuries, Rome was one Italian city-state among many, not particularly powerful or distinctive. Its eventual dominance wasn't inevitable or divinely ordained, but resulted from specific historical circumstances, military adaptations, political innovations, and considerable luck. Why suppress or de-emphasize these realities? Acknowledging Etruscan superiority contradicted the foundation myth. If Rome's greatness came from Etruscan teaching rather than divine favor, the entire narrative of Roman exceptionalism collapsed. Recognizing gradual multicultural development undermined claims of unique Roman genius. If Rome was built through borrowed techniques, absorbed practices, and adopted gods, it became synthesis rather than origin competent but not exceptional. Admitting to cultural borrowing weakened Roman originality claims. Better to present achievements as Roman innovations than as Etruscan, Greek, or Sabine practices that Rome adopted. Preserving detailed records of conquered people's sophistication might inspire rebellion or undermine Roman legitimacy. If subject peoples remembered their own greatness, they might question Roman right to rule. Roman historians themselves sometimes acknowledged these facts. Livy mentioned Etruscan kings, described their achievements, preserved accounts of their influence. Tacitus discussed cultural borrowing. Plutarch recorded alternative foundation stories. But these acknowledgments existed within larger narratives that ultimately reinforced Roman primacy. The facts were admitted, but framed carefully, contextualized to support rather than undermine the official story. The Christian Church inherited this Roman narrative and reinforced it for its own purposes. The Church positioned itself as Rome's spiritual successor. Just as Rome had unified the Mediterranean world politically, Christianity would unify it spiritually. Christianity was presented as the culmination of a progression from pagan Rome to Christian Rome, from political empire to spiritual empire. The papal seat in Rome connected Christian authority to Roman imperial legitimacy. Rome wasn't just another city, but the eternal city, chosen first for political dominion and then for spiritual leadership. The concept of translatio imperii, transfer of empire, linked Roman political authority to Christian spiritual authority in an unbroken chain. This created incentives to maintain the Roman narrative. Questioning Rome's exceptional origins might undermine Christian Rome's exceptional destiny. If Rome wasn't uniquely chosen for political greatness, why should it be uniquely chosen for spiritual authority? Highlighting pre-Roman sophistication complicated the progression narrative from primitive paganism through Roman civilization to Christian truth. Preserving detailed accounts of pre-Roman achievements suggested Rome was less unique and inevitable than claimed, which by extension made Christian Rome seem less inevitable too. These weren't malicious conspiracies. They were structural incentives, institutional self-interest operating through centuries of preservation decisions. Which stories to emphasize, which accounts to copy carefully, which materials to make accessible, which knowledge to restrict. Not destroying alternative narratives too intellectually honest for that, but not emphasizing them either, preserving them quietly, where specialists could access them, while the official story remained dominant. If the Etruscans calculated eclipses centuries before Christ, without scripture or revelation, what did that say about the necessity of Christian truth for human wisdom? The Church's answer was complicated, so were the archives. Medieval Christian thought operated within a specific historical framework. Human history progressed from creation through fall, through the age of Jewish prophecy pointing toward Christ, to Christ's incarnation, and finally to the Church age leading toward the Second Coming. This created a timeline and narrative arc that gave meaning to all human experience. Sophisticated pre-Roman civilizations complicated this framework in ways that created genuine theological problems. First, chronological issues. If pre-Roman peoples possessed advanced astronomical knowledge, sophisticated medical practices, or impressive engineering capabilities, it demonstrated human achievement without Christian revelation or even the Greco-Roman classical culture that Christianity had learned to accommodate. This suggested that wisdom could develop independently of the divinely ordained historical progression. Second, the question of wisdom's source. Christian theology portrayed pagan wisdom as either demonic deception, knowledge granted by fallen angels to mislead humanity, or fragmentary truth, pointing incompletely toward Christ. But what if pre-Roman wisdom was neither? What if it was simply human observation and reason producing genuine knowledge? That created difficult questions about the necessity of revelation for certain types of understanding. Third, the problem of moral pagans. If pre-Roman peoples developed sophisticated ethical systems, enacted just laws, and practiced virtue without biblical revelation, it complicated arguments for Christianity's unique moral authority. Virtuous pagans had troubled Christian thinkers since Augustine, but the more evidence of pre-Christian virtue, the more pressing the theological challenge. Fourth, cultural relativism. Detailed accounts of diverse pre-Roman cultures, each with functional religious and social systems, might suggest that Roman Christian culture was one option among many, rather than the inevitable culmination of human development. This threatened the teleological understanding of history that placed Christianity as the endpoint toward which all previous human experience pointed. Medieval theologians wrestled seriously with these issues when they encountered ancient non-Christian philosophy and science. Aristotle's works, arriving in Western Europe through Arabic translations in the 12th and 13th centuries, created immense theological challenges. Here was a pagan philosopher whose logical rigor and systematic thought rivaled or exceeded Christian thinkers, who had developed sophisticated science without revelation, whose ethics worked without reference to Christian principles. It took a century, and the genius of scholars like Thomas Aquinas, to resolve these challenges through incorporation, absorbing Aristotelian philosophy while reframing it within Christian context. Several strategies emerged for handling problematic ancient wisdom. Incorporation meant absorbing useful knowledge while reframing it in Christian theological terms. Subordination acknowledged pagan achievements, but declared them inferior to Christian wisdom. Attribution claimed ancient wisdom derived from stolen biblical knowledge. Perhaps ancient philosophers had read Moses and borrowed without credit, or from demonic teaching that mixed truth with lies. Selective amnesia meant simply not emphasizing achievements that couldn't be easily explained within the framework. Specific examples show these strategies in action. Some theologians debated whether Plato had encountered Jewish scripture in Egypt, making his wisdom derivative rather than independent. Others claimed ancient technological achievements came through demonic assistance, explaining capability without conceding legitimate wisdom. Pre-Christian knowledge was framed as preparation for the gospel, even when it had no plausible connection to Jewish or Christian tradition. Detailed knowledge about sophisticated pre-Roman Italian civilizations would require similar theological accommodation. If Etruscans had calculated eclipses, predicted celestial events, developed effective medicine, or created just social systems centuries before Christ, theologians would need to explain how this fit within divine historical progression. The options were limited: dismiss their achievements as exaggerated, attribute them to problematic sources, or incorporate them into Christian narrative in ways that might strain credibility. Restricting access to such materials avoided these complications. The knowledge was preserved, intellectual honesty demanded that, but it wasn't widely circulated, which meant most people didn't encounter the theological challenges it posed. Specialists who accessed restricted materials were presumably equipped to engage with difficult questions cautiously, without destabilizing their faith or spreading confusion. Not censorship exactly, not suppression, just careful management of knowledge that created complications the average believer wasn't prepared to navigate. In 1553, a Florentine scholar published a book claiming to have deciphered Etruscan. He was wrong, but in his research, he described examining 47 Etruscan texts in Latin translation from a private Vatican collection. The collection's location was never recorded. The Renaissance changed everything about how Europeans related to the ancient past. Renewed enthusiasm for classical antiquity swept through Italian cities, bringing fascination with ancient languages, texts, and material culture. Scholars believed ancient wisdom offered solutions to contemporary problems. The past wasn't just dead history, it was living resource. This created new interest in pre-Roman Italian cultures, particularly among Italian humanists seeking to establish cultural lineages that predated Roman dominance. Why should Florence or Siena define themselves solely through Roman heritage when they might claim older, more distinguished ancestry? Cities competed for prestigious origins. Florence claimed Etruscan founding rather than Roman colonization. This wasn't just antiquarian curiosity, it was civic identity, political positioning, cultural pride. If Florence descended from sophisticated Etruscans who had taught Rome rather than barbaric tribes Rome had civilized, it elevated the city's status among Italian powers. Scholars began excavating Etruscan sites with genuine archaeological interest. Tombs were opened, inscriptions copied, artifacts collected. Wealthy families sponsored these excavations, assembling private collections of Etruscan materials. Attempts were made to decipher Etruscan writing, usually unsuccessfully, but with tremendous enthusiasm. Theories proliferated about Etruscan origins, achievements, and influence. This created complications for the Church. The papal court itself patronized classical scholarship and Renaissance art. Popes came from wealthy Italian families with regional identities and pride in local heritage. Many Renaissance popes were sophisticated scholars who valued knowledge for its own sake. Pope Nicholas V founded the Vatican Library. The Medici popes sponsored extensive cultural and intellectual projects. Yet the Church also needed to maintain theological orthodoxy and the political narratives that supported papal authority. This required delicate balance. Official policy encouraged classical learning while maintaining that Christian truth superseded pagan wisdom. Pre-Roman materials could be collected and preserved, but their interpretation needed supervision. Scholarship was patronized, but access to problematic materials remained restricted. The Medici popes exemplified this tension. They sponsored Etruscan studies, funded excavations, acquired collections for the Vatican, but they also maintained theological oversight, ensuring that pre-Roman achievements were framed within acceptable interpretative frameworks. Vatican collections grew to include pre-Roman materials, but organizational schemes emphasized Christian cultural superiority even while preserving pagan artifacts. Scholarly debates erupted about how to interpret pre-Roman achievements within Christian historical understanding. Were Etruscans divinely inspired precursors to Rome? Were their accomplishments evidence of universal human reason? Or were they cautionary examples of pagan limitation despite sophistication? Many Renaissance theories about Etruscans were spectacularly wrong, part nationalism, part imagination, part projection of contemporary concerns onto ancient peoples. But incorrect theories still drove collection activity. If scholars wanted to prove their pet theories about Etruscan origins or influence, they needed evidence. This meant seeking out inscriptions, artifacts, texts, anything that might support their arguments. The Vatican benefited from this enthusiasm. Materials were actively sought, purchased from private collectors, excavated from sites, donated by wealthy families seeking papal favor. The Humanist Project, whatever its theoretical errors, created practical incentive to preserve pre-Roman knowledge. Then came the challenge of managing these accumulating collections. Some materials were straightforward artifacts, inscriptions, copies of tomb paintings, and could be studied or displayed openly. Others raised theological questions or political complications and were placed in restricted access. Still, others were simply filed away with inadequate cataloguing, forgotten as scholarly fashions changed and new intellectual concerns replaced Renaissance enthusiasm for pre-Roman Italy. The result is likely that the Vatican has more pre-Roman materials than would otherwise have survived, gathered during the Renaissance when interest peaked and resources were available. But knowing they exist and knowing where they are, what they contain, and how to access them are entirely different questions. Sometimes enthusiasm for collection exceeds capacity for organization. Sometimes materials gather faster than they can be properly catalogued. And sometimes, a scholar mentions examining 47 texts without recording where he found them. Every history textbook you read is already obsolete. Not because historians are wrong, but because archivists are still cataloguing. Somewhere in those 53 miles of shelving, tomorrow's history is waiting. History is never finished. It's constantly being rewritten as new evidence emerges. Old sources get reinterpreted, and different questions are asked of materials that have existed all along. What changes isn't the past itself, but our understanding of it, our picture of what happened and why it mattered. Small discoveries shift entire perspectives. A single inscription can confirm a migration pattern that was previously speculation. A fragment of astronomical text can demonstrate scientific sophistication earlier than anyone assumed. A medical recipe can show cultural transmission across civilizations that supposedly had no contact. A marginal note can reveal that a text considered lost was actually available to medieval scholars, just not widely circulated. Understanding of pre-Roman civilizations has evolved dramatically over the past century. The Etruscans were once portrayed as mysterious Orientals, foreign imports who briefly influenced Italy before Rome's inevitable rise. Now they're recognized as indigenous Italic people who developed sophisticated urban culture independently, who taught Rome more than they learned from it, whose influence shaped Roman religion, architecture, and political institutions fundamentally. The relationship between Rome and its neighbors has shifted from simple conquest narrative, Romans defeating primitives, to recognition of cultural exchange, Roman borrowing, synthesis, rather than pure creation. Rome's genius wasn't inventing everything, but recognizing good ideas regardless of source and incorporating them systematically. The timeline of technological innovations keeps getting pushed backward as evidence of earlier engineering and scientific achievement emerges. Techniques attributed to Romans turn out to have pre-Roman precedents. Scientific observations assumed to begin with, Greeks show up in earlier Italian contexts. The picture becomes more complex, more interesting, less suited to simple narratives about progress and civilization. Vatican sources contribute to this evolving understanding in specific ways. When scholars gain access to previously restricted or uncatalogued materials, they can cross-reference with archaeological findings, verify or disprove claims in known classical sources, discover references to practices or beliefs not mentioned elsewhere, and piece together more complete pictures from fragments that individually seemed insignificant. Some of the most important discoveries come from what might be called history from the margins, materials that weren't part of the main narrative, but were preserved alongside it. Marginal notes in manuscripts where copyists added information from other sources, fragments used as binding material in later books, scrap parchment that survived because it reinforced a spine, misfiled documents in wrong collections, catalogued incorrectly and overlooked for centuries, undertext in palimpsests, scraped away but never fully erased. These marginal materials weren't intentionally preserved for their content. They survived accidentally, incidentally, as byproducts of other preservation activities, but they contain information that the official, intentionally preserved texts don't include. Perspectives that didn't make it into the main narrative. Details considered too minor to copy fully. Knowledge that existed at the edges of what was deemed important. The Vatican Archives, with 53 miles of shelving, and many sections still inadequately catalogued, likely contain numerous such fragments. Materials that could reshape understanding of pre-Roman civilizations if they were identified, studied, recognized for their significance. The challenge is finding them. It requires scholars who know what to look for, who can recognize significance in a single phrase or unusual word choice, technology to reveal hidden text, to recover what's been overwritten or faded to near invisibility, time and resources to examine vast quantities of material, most of which will prove unremarkable, institutional access to restricted collections, permission to examine materials that have been protected for various reasons. Progress is possible but demands patience, expertise, opportunity. The work moves slowly, cataloguer by cataloguer, researcher by researcher, fragment by fragment. No dramatic revelations, just steady accumulation of knowledge that gradually shifts the picture. But shift it does. Each generation understands the ancient world differently than the last. Not because the past changes, but because new evidence emerges from archives, excavations, technological analysis. The story gets richer, more complex, harder to reduce to simple narratives about inevitable progress or clear cultural superiority. Tomorrow's textbooks will tell different stories than today's. Not because today's are wrong, but because tomorrow's will incorporate materials that exist right now, waiting in climate-controlled darkness for someone to recognize their significance. The rewriting continues. The margins still have secrets to share. The Etruscan word for sacred became the Latin word that became the Italian word that became the English word. Language dies. Meaning survives. So does knowledge. If someone decides it's worth saving. Knowledge doesn't belong to single civilizations. It flows between them through trade, conquest, cultural exchange, and deliberate preservation. This simple fact complicates every simplistic narrative about civilizational superiority or inevitable progress. Rome didn't create civilization in Italy. It synthesized and built upon foundations laid by Etruscans, Greeks, Sabines, Oscans, and dozens of other peoples who had already developed sophisticated urban cultures, engineering techniques, religious systems, and bodies of accumulated practical wisdom. Roman genius lay in recognition and incorporation, not pure invention. Christianity didn't emerge from a vacuum. It drew on Jewish theological traditions, Greek philosophical frameworks, Roman legal and organizational structures, and Near Eastern mystical practices. The synthesis was new, but the components had long histories stretching back through earlier civilizations. The Renaissance didn't rediscover ancient knowledge from nothing. It reconnected with transmission chains that had never fully broken. Medieval monks had been copying classical texts throughout the supposed Dark Ages. Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded Greek science. Byzantine libraries had maintained Greek philosophy. The knowledge was there, waiting for renewed European interest. Modern science isn't a purely European innovation. It builds on Islamic astronomy and mathematics, Indian numerical systems, Chinese technological inventions, and ancient Mediterranean observations of nature. The scientific method synthesized insights from multiple cultural traditions into new systematic approaches. What does Vatican preservation of pre-Roman knowledge reveal about this continuity? The Church, despite ideological commitments to Christian supremacy, understood that pagan knowledge had value and worked to preserve it. Medieval monks copying classical texts weren't just maintaining Greek and Roman materials, but entire chains of transmission stretching back through earlier civilizations. The categorization of knowledge as Christian or pagan was often less important practically than whether the knowledge was useful or true. Institutions can simultaneously promote ideological narratives while pragmatically preserving knowledge that complicates those narratives. The contradiction isn't hypocrisy, it's the complex reality of how actual institutions operate, balancing multiple, sometimes conflicting values. For pre-Roman civilizations specifically, this created remarkable continuity. Etruscan religious practices survived in Roman rituals, which were then Christianized, creating an unbroken chain from pre-Roman paganism through Christian sacraments. The forms changed, the theological interpretation shifted, but certain ritual structures persisted across millennia. Engineering techniques from various Italian peoples became Roman engineering and influenced medieval and Renaissance construction. The knowledge wasn't Roman originally, but Rome systematized and transmitted it, and later Christian civilization built upon those transmissions. Agricultural knowledge from ancient Mediterranean cultures, transmitted through Roman texts and medieval copies, still influences farming practices. Techniques developed through centuries of observation didn't become obsolete just because the civilizations that developed them disappeared politically. Astronomical observations from ancient sources, copied and recopied through Roman, Byzantine, and medieval channels, contributed to calendar reforms and eventually modern astronomy. The observers are forgotten, their civilizations erased, but their careful recording of celestial patterns survives in data that remains accurate. This reveals a poignant truth. Civilizations die, but knowledge survives if someone values it enough to preserve it. The Vatican Archives represent an extreme case of institutional preservation, a single institution maintaining continuity across 2 millennia, absorbing knowledge from numerous civilizations: Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Carthaginian, Etruscan, countless others, preserving materials through multiple technological transitions, scroll to codex, manuscript to print, physical to digital, maintaining access even when some materials contradict the institution's official narratives. Not perfect preservation, not complete, not without bias and selective emphasis, but preservation nonetheless, continuous and deliberate, spanning longer than most empires last. The knowledge we have now connects through unbroken chains to knowledge developed thousands of years ago by people whose names we'll never know, whose languages have died, whose cities are dust. But what they learned, what they observed, what they understood that survives, because someone, somewhere, in every generation, decided it was worth saving. In 2025, the Vatican employs 60 archivists for 53 miles of shelving. At current cataloguing rates, completing full detailed catalogue of all holdings will take approximately 300 years. Somewhere in that uncatalogued future is the text that will change what we thought we knew. What we've established across this exploration: the Vatican Archives contain materials acquired over 2 millennia from across the Mediterranean world. Many sections remain inadequately catalogued or studied. Preservation was often accidental rather than systematic. Materials about pre-Roman civilizations exist in fragments scattered across different collections. The question becomes, what might still be waiting? Realistic possibilities include more complete versions of works that currently survive only as fragments, new fragments that expand understanding of particular cultures, translations or copies of texts mentioned in other sources but not yet located, palimpsest undertext, revealing older materials beneath visible manuscripts, misfiled or mislabeled documents that prove significant when correctly identified, cross-references connecting previously isolated fragments into coherent, larger pictures. Imagine if a more complete Etruscan religious text were found, providing enough vocabulary and grammatical structure to enable partial decipherment of the language. Not a full dictionary, but enough to read inscriptions with some confidence, to understand their religious practices from their own perspective, rather than through Roman interpretations. What if a comprehensive Greek account of Carthaginian history turned up, written by someone who had actually lived in Carthage or accessed Punic sources? The Carthaginian perspective on the Punic Wars, their own explanation of their civilization, their version of events that Rome's complete victory erased. Suppose a Roman scholar's translation of a Samnite historical chronicle were discovered, providing their account of their wars with Rome, their reasons for resistance, their own understanding of their culture and achievements before Roman conquest. What if Renaissance excavation notes describing now-lost archaeological finds were identified, giving precise locations for future digs, details about artifacts that have since deteriorated, information that could guide modern archaeology? Even without dramatic complete texts, accumulated fragments matter. Each small find confirms or revises understanding. Multiple fragments can be synthesized into larger insights. The mere existence of materials proves that knowledge was preserved and valued, which tells us something about what ancient and medieval scholars considered important. Technology enables discoveries that weren't possible before. Multispectral imaging reveals palimpsest undertext invisible to previous generations. Digitization allows researchers worldwide to examine materials without traveling to Rome. Computer analysis identifies linguistic patterns and cross-references across vast databases. Improved dating techniques determine when materials were created versus copied, revealing chains of transmission. Discovering significant pre-Roman materials wouldn't overthrow established history. It would enrich and complicate it. Understanding of cultural transmission in the ancient Mediterranean would shift. Narratives of Roman exceptionalism and Christian uniqueness would require nuance. The value of institutional preservation, even when motivated by complex or contradictory purposes, would be demonstrated. The archives are there. Scholars continue working. Technology improves. Access expands, slowly but steadily. The materials that will rewrite tomorrow's textbooks may already be catalogued, just not yet recognized for their significance. Or they may be waiting in boxes that haven't been opened in centuries, in sections that won't be systematically examined for decades, behind doors that will open to researchers we haven't trained yet. 300 years to complete detailed cataloguing. That timeline contains possibility. Discovery isn't finished. Understanding isn't complete. The conversation between past and present continues, mediated by archivists, scholars, technology, and time. Somewhere in climate-controlled darkness, on shelves that stretch beyond sight, among documents in languages living and dead, knowledge waits. Not all of it dramatic, not all of it revolutionary, but some of it surprising, some of it significant, some of it capable of shifting how we understand who came before us and what they knew. The door is still locked to most of us, but the archives are patient. Knowledge is patient. And eventually, what's hidden finds its way into light.